Story 1. The Stranger at Moosehead Lake. James Mitchell had been meticulously planning this solo camping trip for several months with obsessive detail. At 30 years old, working as a veterinarian in Portland, Maine, he felt the constant and crushing pressure of responsibility weighing down heavily on his shoulders every single day of his life without respite. The demands of his veterinary practice were absolutely relentless and unforgiving in ways that most people couldn't understand. Emergency surgeries on beloved family pets at all hours of the day and night. Anxious and sometimes angry pet owners demanding immediate solutions to their animals' problems. Complex administrative responsibilities that seemed to multiply exponentially with each passing day. Dealing with difficult and demanding staff members, managing inventory and budgets, and the emotional weight of having to make life and death decisions on a regular basis that affected not just the animals, but the families he served. The stress was constant and unrelenting, affecting his sleep quality, his relationships with friends and family, his physical health, and his mental well-being in ways he couldn't ignore or minimize. 2 weeks of vacation had finally come after months of waiting and careful planning, and he decided to spend it exactly where he wanted, completely alone in the remote wilderness of Maine, far from all the noise and chaos of his daily professional life in the city. He had fantasized about this trip during late nights at the clinic, imagining the peace and solitude that awaited him. His colleagues had suggested tropical vacations or weekend getaways to luxury resorts, but James knew what he really needed was silence, solitude, and the healing power of nature. The trail leading to Moosehead Lake was moderately challenging and required genuine physical effort and determination. It took about 6 hours of steady hiking before he reached the perfect camping spot that he'd identified during his research phase months earlier. He'd chosen a location about a quarter-mile off the main trail, nestled peacefully between 2 large pine trees, with a clear and beautiful view of the pristine water below. It was late September, and the weather was still quite pleasant during the day, though the nights were getting progressively colder with each passing evening as autumn advanced toward winter. James had brought all the necessary gear carefully selected for this trip. A quality 4-season tent that could withstand harsh weather conditions and mountain storms, a high-quality sleeping bag rated for temperatures well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, a reliable and tested camping stove for cooking meals, plenty of food supplies that would last him through the entire week of camping, proper water purification tablets to keep him healthy, a first aid kit, backup batteries, a satellite phone for emergencies, and various other supplies and equipment carefully packed and organized. The hike itself had been rejuvenating. As James walked the trail, he felt the weight of the city beginning to lift from his shoulders. The sound of his footsteps on the forest floor, the smell of pine and earth, the occasional bird call, these simple things reminded him why he loved nature. He stopped several times to take photographs with his phone, capturing the way light filtered through the trees, the moss-covered rocks, the small streams that crossed the trail. By the time he reached his chosen campsite, his muscles ached pleasantly, and his mind felt clearer than it had in months. The first day was peaceful and genuinely rejuvenating for his stressed mind and tired body after months of relentless work. James set up his campsite with methodical precision and attention to detail, arranging everything exactly just the way he liked it. He spent hours carefully building a fire pit, surrounded by large rocks selected from the area, tested his camping stove multiple times to make absolutely sure it was working properly in all conditions and weather, and carefully stored his food supplies in a bear bag hanging from a high branch, well away from his actual sleeping area. He had read extensively about wildlife safety and bear encounters, and he was taking no chances. As the sun began to set over the mountains in spectacular fashion, he sat by the fire with a warm cup of hot coffee, watching the sky transform into beautiful shades of orange and pink before gradually fading into deep purple and eventually black as darkness fell, completely. The silence surrounding him was profound and almost overwhelming. No cars honking, no people talking, no ringing phones demanding attention, no emergency calls about sick animals, just the sound of the wind moving through the tall trees and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. James felt his shoulders physically relax for the first time in many months, the deep tension of his work life beginning to melt away into the forest around him. He lay in his sleeping bag that first night, feeling more content than he could remember being in years. That night, he slept better than he had in years, his body finally able to release the stress and tension it had been holding for so long. His dreams were peaceful and vivid, childhood memories of camping trips with his father, adventures in simpler times when his biggest worry was whether they would catch enough fish for dinner. The second day followed a similar peaceful pattern of quiet relaxation and exploration. James woke up at dawn feeling genuinely refreshed and energized, the morning light filtering through the tent fabric. He made a simple breakfast of coffee and oatmeal over his camping stove, spent the morning exploring the area around his campsite with his camera taking photographs, and returned for lunch made from his supplies. He read a book he'd brought, a thriller he'd been meaning to finish for months, though he found himself distracted by the natural beauty around him. He took a long walk along the beautiful shoreline of the pristine lake, noticing the different varieties of trees and plants, observing a beaver dam in the distance. He even managed to spot a moose in the distance, standing in the shallow water and feeding peacefully on water plants. The sight was magical, prehistoric almost, and James sat quietly for nearly an hour watching the animal, not wanting to disturb its peaceful meal. Everything felt absolutely perfect, like he'd found the place he needed to be. In the late afternoon, around 4 p.m., as he was preparing a meal over his camping stove, a simple pasta dish with dried vegetables, he heard something completely unexpected that immediately shattered the peaceful silence. The distinct sound of footsteps approaching his camp from the direction of the main trail. James looked up immediately, startled by the sound and broken from his peaceful state. His first thought was one of irritation. He had specifically chosen this remote location to avoid encountering other people. He hadn't expected to see or hear anyone else on this particular section of the trail in the middle of nowhere. In the 2 days he'd been there, he hadn't encountered a single hiker or even seen any wildlife up close except for the moose in the distance. The footsteps were getting progressively closer, crunching distinctly on the dried leaves and twigs that covered the forest floor in a regular rhythm. James quickly assessed the situation carefully. He was completely alone, miles from the nearest town or help, and a stranger was approaching his campsite without any prior warning or announcement. A man emerged from the trees, stepping into the small clearing where James had set up his camp. His sudden appearance felt almost ominous, as if he had materialized from the forest itself rather than walked out from the trail. He looked like any typical backpacker one might see on a trail, around 50 years old, wearing weathered hiking boots that had seen many miles, faded cargo pants with several pockets, and a well-worn backpack that showed obvious signs of heavy use over many years. His overall appearance was casual enough, though there was something distinctly odd about his demeanor that immediately made James feel deeply uncomfortable and uneasy in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The man smiled when he saw James by the fire, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. There was something calculating about it, something cold and predatory that suggested the smile was more of a mask than a genuine expression of friendliness or warmth. His eyes seemed to look through James rather than at him. "Hey there," the man said casually, as if they'd known each other for many years and had simply run into each other on the trail by chance. His voice was smooth but lacked inflection. "I'm trying to find the cabin. You know where it is? I've been looking for it all afternoon, and I'm starting to think I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere out here." James relaxed slightly, though he certainly wasn't completely at ease. It was a simple question, the kind of thing hikers asked each other regularly when they were trying to navigate remote trails in unfamiliar territory. Rational thought returned to push away the instinctive unease. "There's a shelter about 2 miles northeast," James replied, pointing in the general direction with his hand, eager to provide directions that would send the stranger on his way. "It's not maintained by the Park Service, but it's there. Just follow the trail markers, and you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. The markings are pretty clear if you pay close attention." "Thanks," the man said, but he didn't leave immediately or move toward the trail as James expected. Instead, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other and looked slowly around the entire campsite, taking in every single detail as if cataloging it for future reference or creating a mental map. His eyes moved slowly across James's tent, his supplies arranged neatly, his fire pit, his food storage area, methodically cataloging everything he saw. James felt his skin prickle with discomfort at the intensity of the stranger's scrutiny. "Nice spot you've got here. You alone out here?" The question hung in the air like a threat, though the tone remained neutral and casual. James felt a flash of warning in his gut, but pushed it aside. "Yeah, just me," James admitted, immediately regretting having answered so directly and honestly. He should have been more cautious about revealing that information to a complete stranger in the middle of the wilderness where no one knew he was. Why had he answered so readily? Why hadn't he lied? "That's cool," the man said, and something in his tone made James's skin prickle with an inexplicable sense of dread and foreboding that went beyond normal social anxiety. "Peaceful out here. Nobody around for miles, I imagine. Just you and the forest and the wildlife." They talked for several more minutes. Casual conversation about the trail conditions, the weather patterns, and the best places to camp in Maine. The man seemed friendly enough on the surface, asking reasonable questions and making polite observations. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong or off about this person. There was an intensity to the stranger's gaze, a calculation behind his words and questions that didn't match his casual demeanor and outwardly friendly tone. It was as if the man was evaluating James carefully, studying him methodically, trying to figure something important out about him and his situation. The stranger's eyes kept drifting back to James's tent, his supplies, his vulnerable position in the forest. Eventually, the man said he should get moving before dark settled in completely. "Thanks for the directions," he said, turning to walk back toward the trail. "Enjoy your camping. Hope you have a nice, peaceful time out here." There was something almost sarcastic in that last statement, as if the man didn't believe James would have a peaceful time, or as if he knew something James didn't. James watched him disappear into the trees, feeling oddly relieved to see him go, though he couldn't quite explain why he felt that relief so strongly. Every part of his body had tensed during the encounter. He tried to shake off his unease and return to preparing his evening meal carefully, but his appetite had diminished significantly. He picked at his food, his mind replaying the conversation, analyzing every word the stranger had said, every gesture, every look. But as the sun began to set and darkness crept slowly into the forest, an inexplicable anxiety began to build in his chest. He couldn't quite identify the source of his worry, but it was there, persistent, and growing stronger with each passing minute. Why had the man looked at his tent that way? Why had he seemed so interested in whether James was alone? The questions circled in his mind like predators. That night, James had significant trouble sleeping, despite his exhaustion from the previous night's deep sleep and the day's activities. Every sound made him jump, the cracking of a branch in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant howl of what he hoped was a wolf but feared might be something else entirely. He lay in his sleeping bag, alert and tense, listening intently to every noise in the darkness, wondering if the stranger was still out there somewhere in the forest, watching him, observing him from the shadows. His rational mind told him he was being paranoid, but his instincts screamed danger. He had worked with animals long enough to recognize that primal fear response, and he knew better than to ignore it. Around midnight, James heard something that made his blood run cold, and his heart begin to race. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling his tent in the complete darkness surrounding him. They were unmistakable, the sound of a human walking, deliberately and carefully, around his tent in a slow, methodical circle. He held his breath immediately, trying to move as quietly as possible, afraid of making any noise that might draw attention to himself from whoever was outside the thin tent walls. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if the person was examining his campsite carefully and methodically, studying every detail. James had a flashlight within arm's reach of his sleeping bag, but he was absolutely terrified to use it, afraid of what he might illuminate if he shone the light out into the darkness beyond the tent. What if the stranger was standing right there, waiting to see if James was awake? The footsteps continued, circling around and around his tent, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes. The sound was so close that James was absolutely certain whoever was out there could hear his racing heartbeat through the tent fabric. He counted the footsteps, trying to determine the circler's pace and pattern. The person seemed to pause occasionally, perhaps looking at something, perhaps listening. James's mind raced through possibilities. Was it definitely the same man? Was there more than one person? Could this be an animal that sounded like a person? But no. The deliberate, methodical nature of the walking ruled out animals. This was human. This was intentional. Then the footsteps stopped, and silence returned to the night like a sudden blanket that was somehow even more terrifying than the sound had been. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying than the sound of the footsteps had been. James lay in his tent, heart pounding violently in his chest, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the cool night air. He waited, listening intently, for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, before the sun finally began to rise over the mountains, and the sky started to lighten with the approaching dawn. James remained motionless, barely breathing, until gray morning light began to filter through the tent fabric, and the forest sounds gradually returned to normal. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, James immediately packed up his tent and belongings, working as quickly as he possibly could manage. His hands were shaking noticeably as he gathered his gear together in a haphazard fashion, his mind torn between wanting to leave immediately and the desire to investigate what had happened in the night. He didn't bother with breakfast or a proper breakdown of his campsite. He just grabbed his backpack and started walking back down the trail toward civilization and safety, moving faster than was safe on the uneven terrain. He made good time heading down the trail, his fear propelling him forward. But after about an hour of walking, something made him stop halfway down the trail. A strange compulsion, an overwhelming urge to know what had happened, made him retrace his steps back to his campsite, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him not to do so. It was as if he was being pulled back, as if something wasn't finished. When he arrived back at the location where he'd spent the last 2 nights, he found something that made his heart stop completely. The campsite was utterly and completely empty, not just abandoned with some of his belongings gone, completely gone, as if erased by some cosmic force. The rocks he'd carefully arranged for his fire pit had been scattered across the ground in random directions. The bear bag he'd hung from the tree branch was lying on the ground, shredded and torn apart violently. His tent was still standing, but when he looked inside, all his belongings, his sleeping bag, his backpack, his food supplies, his toiletries, everything, had vanished without any trace or explanation. It was as if he'd never been there at all, as if the entire 2 days had been nothing but a dream, or a hallucination, something his mind had created. James stood in stunned silence, trying to process what he was seeing. This didn't make sense. How was this possible? Had someone stolen everything? But why leave the tent standing? Why not take the tent itself? The questions spiraled through his mind. James stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the evidence of a campsite that seemed to have been completely erased from existence. He was wearing the clothes on his back, and absolutely nothing else. No supplies, no equipment, no way to navigate back to civilization except for the trail he'd come in on. The realization that someone had been in his campsite, had taken all his belongings deliberately, was almost more terrifying than anything that had happened the night before. He understood now what had happened during those circling footsteps. The stranger had been searching his campsite, had been gathering his possessions, had been preparing for this moment. With growing panic and desperation, James began to run. He ran down the trail as fast as his legs would carry him, not stopping, not looking back, pushing himself to the absolute limits of his physical endurance, despite his body's protests. He didn't stop running until he reached the trailhead and saw his car sitting exactly where he'd left it, a symbol of the normal world and safety. When he finally arrived back in civilization, dirty and exhausted and shaking with fear, he immediately drove to the local police station and reported the incident in detail. He explained everything. The man, the circling footsteps, the vanishing campsite. The officers took his statement with expressions of skepticism, but it was clear from their expressions and tone that they thought he'd either imagined the whole thing or was fabricating the story for some unknown reason, perhaps for attention, or as some kind of prank. There was no record of anyone matching the stranger's description in the area, no reports of theft or theft attempts, nothing to support his claims or corroborate his story. When park rangers went to investigate the location James described, they found nothing unusual, a normal campsite spot with no signs of disturbance. James never went camping again after that experience. Years later, he still can't explain what happened that night. The man, the footsteps, the vanishing campsite, all of it remains a mystery that still haunts him late at night when he tries to sleep. The experience has fundamentally changed how he views the wilderness and his relationship with nature. He often wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, reliving those moments. He never returned to Maine for vacations, never ventured into remote wilderness areas, never trusted the solitude he once craved. The man's face still appears in his dreams sometimes, that cold smile, those calculating eyes. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, James hears the sound of footsteps circling his house, and he has to remind himself that he's safe, that he's home, that it was just a camping trip that went terribly wrong. Story 2. Whispers in Caribou Forest. Marcus and David had been inseparable best friends since high school, meeting in the 9th grade in their first history class and sticking together through all the ups and downs that life had thrown at them over the years. They had supported each other through college, career changes, relationship breakups, family tragedies, and all the complexity and challenges that adulthood brought. They had met in the 9th grade in their first history class when Marcus sat behind David, and they had formed an instant and lasting friendship that had endured through the decades without wavering. Now, at 28 years old, both successful in their respective careers, Marcus as a software engineer at a major tech company, David as a marketing professional at an advertising firm, they decided to take what they called their annual adventure week, a carefully planned trip into the wilderness where they would challenge themselves both physically and mentally, far away from the responsibilities and demands of their everyday lives and the constant connectivity of modern technology. This year, after much planning and discussion over several months, they'd chosen Caribou Forest in Nova Scotia, an area known for its dense woods, pristine lakes, and relative isolation from civilization and modern technology. The forest was legendary among outdoor enthusiasts for its untouched beauty, challenging terrain, and the sense of timelessness one felt while hiking through it. Local guides had warned them about the remoteness of certain areas, but Marcus and David were confident in their abilities and prepared to handle any challenges the wilderness might present. They had both completed several wilderness courses and felt secure in their knowledge and training. The two men were experienced campers with years of accumulated knowledge and skills from previous trips to different wilderness areas. They'd done this kind of trip several times before, traveling to different wilderness areas each year, from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian Trail, and they prided themselves on their knowledge of survival skills, outdoor equipment, wilderness navigation, and emergency procedures. They had invested in quality gear and spent considerable time preparing for this expedition. They arrived at the forest on a Friday afternoon in late summer, hiking about 8 miles into the wilderness before finding a suitable camping location near a small, clear lake that looked like something from a nature photograph. The weather was cool but not uncomfortable, and they spent the first evening setting up their camp methodically and preparing their first meal over an open fire, with food they'd brought from home. Marcus was a software engineer, analytical and methodical in everything he did in his professional and personal life. He approached camping with the same systematic precision he brought to his work, designing complex software systems, carefully organizing equipment, planning routes down to the smallest detail, and considering all possible contingencies that might arise during their trip. His tent was set up with military precision, his supplies organized in a logical system, his navigation tools checked and double-checked. David worked in marketing and was the more spontaneous of the two, always ready for adventure and comfortable with improvisation when plans changed unexpectedly. Together, they made a good team, each balancing the other's personality and approach to problem-solving and decision-making. They complemented each other well. Marcus's caution balanced David's adventurousness. As the sun set on that first evening in spectacular fashion, they sat by their campfire, talking and laughing about old times and inside jokes that only they understood after so many years of friendship together. They reminisced about their early days as friends, about the camping trip where Marcus fell into a creek, about David's famous attempt at cooking outdoors that had resulted in near-inedible food. The forest around them was peaceful and beautiful in the fading light, and they felt genuinely content with their decision to spend a week in this remote location. Around 9 o'clock, after finishing their meal and carefully cleaning up their campsite to avoid attracting wildlife, according to proper wilderness protocol, they decided to call it a night and retreated to their respective tents to get some sleep, falling asleep quickly after the exertion of the long hike. That's when the sounds started to become apparent and increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, they were subtle, barely perceptible above the normal sounds of the forest at night, which included wind through trees, distant animal calls, and the occasional crackling of dying fire embers and insects making nocturnal sounds. But as the night wore on and the hours passed slowly, the sounds became more distinct and clearly audible to both men who were lying in their tents. It sounded like whispers, like voices speaking in low tones, as if people were having conversations just beyond the reach of clear hearing and understanding. Though neither Marcus nor David could make out any actual words or understand what the voices were saying, the sound of human speech was unmistakable and undeniable, almost like radio static forming words just out of comprehension. The sounds seemed to be coming from all around the camp, echoing through the trees from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible to locate the source precisely. Marcus lay in his tent, listening intently to the mysterious whispers that seemed to surround his campsite like an invisible presence. He told himself it was just the wind moving through the forest, creating sounds that his tired mind was interpreting as voices and human speech, a phenomenon known as pareidolia. But the more he listened, the more convinced he became that the sounds were actually human voices, engaged in some kind of hushed conversation or communication with each other. The voices had rhythm and cadence, patterns that suggested speech rather than natural phenomena. Around midnight, David unzipped his tent and called out to Marcus across the dark campsite, his voice tight with tension and barely concealed fear about what was making the sound. "Are you hearing that?" he asked, his words coming out slightly shaky. "Tell me you're hearing that too, and I'm not going crazy." "Yeah," Marcus admitted reluctantly, his own voice shaking slightly with the adrenaline of fear and uncertainty. "I've been listening to it for the past hour. I can't figure out where it's coming from, or what it is, or why." "What is it?" David asked, moving closer to the dying fire for comfort. "What do you think is making that sound out there in the darkness?" "I don't know," Marcus replied, trying to sound calm and rational, even though he wasn't feeling calm or rational about the situation. "Wind, maybe? Animals? Some kind of acoustic phenomenon caused by the landscape and the way sound travels through the forest and mountains? Like sound bouncing off rock formations?" His scientific mind was trying to rationalize what they were hearing, but doubt was creeping in. They spent the rest of that long night awake, listening to the whispers that continued throughout the darkness without any break or change or variation, a constant background of unintelligible speech. By the time the sun finally began to rise over the horizon with the approaching dawn, both men were exhausted and on edge, their nerves completely frayed from the lack of sleep and the constant exposure to the mysterious sounds that had plagued them all night. They had not slept a single minute, their bodies tense and vigilant. The whispers faded as dawn broke, and light began to penetrate the forest, dispelling the darkness, and they emerged from their tents to investigate the area around their campsite carefully. They moved cautiously through the forest, searching for any source of the sounds, any evidence of other people or animals in the area around them. But the campsite showed no signs of disturbance whatsoever. There were no tracks in the soft earth around their camp, no evidence of anyone or anything having been nearby during the night, no trampled vegetation, no signs of a campfire or human presence, nothing that would indicate other people had been there. The ground around their camp was undisturbed, which made the mystery even more unsettling. Marcus and David tried to rationalize what they'd heard during the long, sleepless night. "Maybe it's some kind of acoustic phenomenon," Marcus suggested, trying to convince both himself and David with some explanation that made scientific sense. "Sound bouncing off rocks or water in a way that creates voices and makes them sound human. That's actually a documented thing that happens in certain natural environments and locations. I read about it once." He sounded uncertain, even as he spoke. David wasn't convinced by this explanation, but he wanted to believe his friend and wanted to put this experience behind them so they could enjoy their trip as planned. They decided to continue with their trip as planned, pushing forward with determination despite their exhaustion. They prepared a hearty breakfast using their camping stove and fresh provisions, though neither man had much appetite, and spent the day hiking and exploring the surrounding area, climbing hills and finding beautiful viewpoints that overlooked the landscape and the distant lake. They moved quickly, perhaps subconsciously wanting to distance themselves from the campsite. By evening, they'd almost convinced themselves that the previous night's experience had been nothing more than a trick of exhaustion and the power of an overactive imagination combined with stress and the power of suggestion. But as darkness fell again, and night descended on the forest once more, so did their peace of mind and sense of safety return to being threatened. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere as the sun set, a heaviness to the air. That second night, the whispers returned with a vengeance, and they seemed noticeably closer and more intense than before, as if whatever was making the sounds had moved nearer to their camp during the day, more urgent in their tone, more desperate in their quality, more insistent in their persistence. The quality of the voices had changed dramatically. They no longer sounded like casual conversation, but rather like people who were trying desperately to communicate something important or urgent, like a cry for help. Marcus and David sat by their campfire, trying their best to ignore the sounds, but it was completely impossible and impractical. The whispers had become more distinct, and both men were absolutely certain they could almost make out individual words, fragments that sounded like names, places, pleas. Though the meaning remained frustratingly, just beyond their comprehension. The voices almost seemed to be calling to them. Around 2 a.m, David suddenly stood up from where he was sitting by the fire, startling Marcus, who had been staring into the flames. "I'm going into the forest," he announced abruptly, his mind apparently made up, despite the obvious danger, "to find out what's making those sounds. I can't take another night of this mystery and not knowing." His exhaustion and fear had transformed into a need to understand, to confront whatever was out there. "That's absolutely insane," Marcus protested strongly and urgently, standing up to face his friend. "You can't go out there in the dark alone. You could get lost or hurt or run into something dangerous out there. Please stay here where it's relatively safe." Marcus tried to appeal to David's logic, but he could see that David was beyond rational argument at this point. "I have a flashlight," David countered, holding it up for emphasis, the beam cutting through the darkness. "And I can't take another night of this uncertainty and fear. I need to know what's causing the whispers." Before Marcus could physically stop him or make a more convincing argument to keep him there, David grabbed his flashlight and disappeared into the trees, moving quickly into the darkness. Marcus sat by the dying fire, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum, wondering if he should follow his friend or wait for his return. Minutes turned into hours. David didn't return to the campsite. The whispers continued, seemingly unabated by David's departure. Marcus knew he should go after his friend immediately, but he was terrified of what he might encounter in the darkness beyond the firelight. The whispers had grown even louder in David's absence, reaching a crescendo, and Marcus was beginning to believe they were not the product of wind or acoustic phenomena. They sounded like real voices, calling, beckoning, trying to lure someone into the darkness of the forest. He stood and paced back and forth, wrestling with the decision to follow David or stay by the fire. Around dawn, as the first light of morning began to break through the trees, David emerged from the forest looking absolutely terrified and traumatized by whatever he had experienced. He looked absolutely terrified. His clothes were torn and muddy from running through brush and dense vegetation. His face was scratched and bleeding from branches and thorns that had whipped at his skin, and his eyes had a wild, hunted expression in them, like an animal that had been chased by a predator for hours through the darkness. He was breathing heavily, gasping for air, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. "What happened?" Marcus demanded, rushing to his friend's side with immediate concern and worry, trying to steady him. "What did you see? Where have you been all night?" David collapsed next to the fire, his legs apparently unable to support him any longer, and it took him several minutes to catch his breath enough to speak coherently about his experience. His teeth were chattering, and he couldn't stop shaking. "There's someone out there," he finally managed to say, his voice shaking with fear and what sounded like remnants of shock. "Someone following me. A man. His skin was wrong, gray and stretched across his face like it didn't fit properly. His eyes were, God, Marcus, his eyes were completely wrong. They were positioned too far apart, not like normal human eyes, and they didn't look human at all. They glowed in my flashlight beam. He kept chasing me, getting closer and closer, and I could hear him breathing behind me, his breathing getting faster and more intense with each stride. But when I turned to look directly at him, he'd just vanish into the darkness like he was never there." "You're in shock," Marcus said, trying to sound calm, even though he was absolutely terrified by what David was describing. "We need to get out of here, now, immediately." Marcus started packing their essentials without waiting for a response. They didn't pack up their camp properly, or follow any kind of organized procedure for breaking down their campsite. They simply grabbed their backpacks, threw in whatever was closest and most essential, their phones, some water, their wallets, and started running down the trail that led out of the forest. They ran for several hours without stopping to rest, without stopping to check their direction or catch their breath. They just ran, driven by pure fear and desperation, pushing their bodies to the limit. When they finally emerged at the trailhead hours later, both men were exhausted, traumatized, and desperate to leave this place and return to civilization and safety. They drove back in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what had happened in Caribou Forest. Neither man wanted to speak about the experience, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. David refused to talk about the experience for years after that night. He seemed haunted by it, changed in some fundamental way. He quit his job in marketing and took a position that allowed him to work from home, rarely leaving his house. Eventually, years later, He did share a few more details with Marcus over drinks, details he'd been keeping locked away in his mind. He said the thing he'd seen in the forest wasn't quite human in its movement or appearance. It moved wrong, with jerky, unnatural motions that didn't follow the normal laws of physics or human biomechanics, as if it was learning how to move by mimicking human movement. Its face was twisted in what might have been a smile, though it looked more like a grimace of pain or hunger, or both combined. And the worst part, David said, was that when it chased him through the darkness, he could have sworn it was speaking his name, calling to him in a voice that sounded almost familiar, beckoning him to stop and wait. Marcus and David never went camping together again, and they rarely ventured into the wilderness alone. They're still friends, still close despite the changes that have occurred in both their lives, and they maintain regular contact, but they never speak about that night in Caribou Forest. Some experiences, they've both decided, are best left in the past, unspoken and unexamined. The friendship that had lasted so many years remained intact, but there was now a boundary that neither would cross, a topic that remained permanently off limits. They still see each other occasionally, but the easy camaraderie of their youth has been replaced by something more guarded, more cautious, shadowed by what they experienced in the Story 3. The Record Player of Stone Creek. Robert Chen was a high school history teacher with a deep and genuine passion for solitude and the quiet contemplation that the wilderness could provide to a weary soul yearning for peace. His work was demanding in ways that most people outside of education couldn't truly understand or appreciate, managing 30 students per class with varying levels of engagement and behavioral issues, dealing with concerned and sometimes angry parents who questioned his teaching methods, attending countless faculty meetings about standardized testing and curriculum changes, grading papers and tests late into the evening, and managing the emotional labor of being responsible for students' education, and in some cases, their well-being. He desperately needed time alone to recharge his emotional batteries and reconnect with himself away from civilization and the constant demands of modern society. In the fall of 2001, he decided to take a week off from his teaching responsibilities and go camping in Vermont, specifically in the Stone Creek Trail area, known for its scenic beauty, dramatic elevation changes, and relative isolation from civilization and the modern world. Robert was 52 years old, fit for his age from years of outdoor activities and regular exercise, including hiking and kayaking, and well prepared for solo camping adventures, having done this for many years. He'd been camping since his college years, and had all the skills and equipment necessary for a comfortable solo trip into the wilderness. He knew how to navigate using map and compass, how to filter water, how to identify edible plants, and most importantly, how to manage fear and solitude in remote locations. He arrived at his chosen campsite on a Monday morning in early October, spent the entire day setting up his camp carefully and methodically, checking all his equipment twice for functionality, and settled in for what he thought would be a peaceful, rejuvenating week away from civilization and all of its demands on his time and energy. The first few days were exactly what he'd hoped for, and needed so desperately. He hiked through beautiful forests filled with fall foliage in shades of crimson, gold, and amber, read books by his campfire under the stars, cooked simple meals over his camping stove using fresh ingredients he'd brought, and enjoyed the profound, quiet beauty of the forest. On Wednesday morning, as he was gathering firewood near his campsite for the evening fire, moving through the forest collecting fallen branches, he heard something unexpected and deeply unsettling that made him stop dead in his tracks. Music. It was classical music, something that sounded like Chopin, or perhaps Brahms, possibly a nocturne or a prelude, being played loudly through what appeared to be a speaker or small amplifier connected to a power source. Robert was immediately puzzled and concerned about what he was hearing. He was miles from any trail or road, in one of the most remote sections of the park where few people ventured, certainly not to this location. There was no way a modern electronic device like that should be out here in the wilderness, operating by itself independently. How was it even powered? Where was the music coming from? Following the sound of the music carefully, noting where the volume seemed to increase, Robert discovered the source about 100 yards from his campsite in a small clearing he hadn't previously noticed. An old record player, complete with vinyl records stacked nearby, set up carefully on a flat rock near the clearing. The record was spinning slowly, playing the same classical composition over and over again in an endless loop that suggested it had been playing for a long time. Robert stood there, staring at it, trying to comprehend what he was seeing and make sense of it. His rational mind struggled to explain the presence of this device in the wilderness. Robert approached the record player cautiously, his mind racing with questions about how it got here, why someone would place it here, and what possible purpose it could serve. The record player and records looked old, not antique exactly, but at least 30 or 40 years old based on their design, color fading, and condition. The machine appeared to be working perfectly, despite being completely exposed to the elements and weather, rain and sun and wind. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no evidence of a recent campsite or any human habitation in the immediate area around the record player. No footprints, no trash, no signs of recent activity, nothing. This was deeply unsettling and disturbing in ways Robert couldn't quite articulate. Record players were not common in the modern world, let alone in the wilderness. This was not something someone had simply abandoned and left behind by accident or carelessness. This was something that someone had deliberately brought to this remote location and carefully set up to play continuously on repeat. Someone had made a deliberate, premeditated effort to place this here, which meant someone had invested significant time and resources. Robert unplugged the record player carefully and examined it more closely to understand how it was operating and functioning, despite being outdoors. The cord was attached to a battery pack, cleverly concealed beneath the rock to protect it from the elements and weather. A waterproof battery pack designed for outdoor use. Someone had gone to considerable effort and planning to set this up in this remote location, had selected equipment suitable for outdoor use, had ensured it would continue playing. Someone was leaving him a message, though Robert couldn't begin to understand what that message was supposed to be, or why someone would do this to a stranger, or what the intended recipient was supposed to understand from it. He decided to leave the record player where it was and return to his campsite, trying to put the strange discovery out of his mind and focus on his vacation and his need for peace. He tried to convince himself that it was probably just the result of some bizarre prank. Perhaps other hikers or campers were playing a joke on him as some kind of entertainment or test or artistic expression. It was certainly an unsettling prank, but probably nothing to genuinely worry about or fear. Perhaps some eccentric artist was creating an outdoor art installation. Perhaps students were conducting an experiment. Perhaps, but his justifications rang hollow. That night, Robert couldn't sleep, despite his exhaustion from the day's hiking and activities. He kept thinking about the record player, about the considerable effort someone had gone to in order to set it up in this remote location. He kept wondering what the purpose was and what kind of message someone was trying to send. More importantly, he kept wondering where whoever had set it up currently was and whether they were still nearby in the forest watching him, observing his reactions. The thought terrified him. Why would someone do this? What did it mean? Was he being watched? Was this some kind of threat or warning? On Thursday morning, after another sleepless night, Robert made a decision that he immediately regretted making. He would pack up his campsite and return to the trailhead. He'd had enough of the wilderness and this mysterious situation. The record player had spooked him badly, and he wanted to be back in civilization where things made sense and followed logical explanations. He needed to be around other people, away from this disturbing mystery. He began packing his tent methodically and gathering his possessions together carefully, moving with purpose and efficiency. That's when he noticed something terribly wrong and disturbing that made his heart skip. His sleeping bag was missing from where he'd left it in his tent. Robert looked around his campsite very carefully, his movements now frantic. Everything else was in its proper place. His tent was fine, his backpack was there, his cooking equipment was untouched, his food supplies were still stored properly, but his sleeping bag had vanished without a trace or explanation. It was gone. Simply gone. Robert's heart began to race, and his breathing became shallow and quick, his panic rising. Someone had been in his campsite while he was away during the day, exploring and gathering the encounter with the record player. Someone had come here deliberately, had entered his tent, and had taken his sleeping bag as if to send a message that said someone was watching, that his privacy had been violated, that he was vulnerable. This was no longer a prank or coincidence. This was something sinister and threatening, and Robert knew he needed to leave immediately and get to safety. Without his sleeping bag, Robert couldn't safely camp in the increasingly cold Vermont nights, especially as autumn was advancing, and the temperature would drop significantly into freezing territory. He decided to abandon most of his equipment and hike back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. He gathered only his wallet, his keys, and his phone, leaving everything else behind: his tent, his equipment, his remaining food supplies. He began walking down the trail, moving quickly despite his age and the uneven terrain, trying to escape whatever was happening in this place. As he walked down the trail, trying to maintain his pace and focus on reaching civilization and safety, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. His sleeping bag was lying on the trail, rolled up neatly, about 50 yards from where his campsite had been located. Robert cautiously approached it, moving slowly and carefully, like he was approaching a dangerous animal that might react if startled. It was definitely his sleeping bag, and it appeared untouched and undamaged from what he could see. This was clearly intentional. Someone was playing a game, retrieving his sleeping bag and placing it where he would find it. He grabbed it quickly and continued down the trail as fast as he could manage without falling, his mind reeling with questions about what was happening and why. But over the next hour of walking, as he continued down the trail toward the trailhead, he began to see more of his possessions scattered along the trail in a systematic pattern that suggested careful planning. His cooking pot appeared on a rock beside the trail. His water bottle was hanging from a tree branch at eye level, placed there deliberately. His camp chair was sitting in the middle of the trail, blocking his path forward. His sleeping mat was draped over a fallen tree. His clothes were hanging from branches. It was as if someone was deliberately leaving a trail of his own belongings behind him, creating a breadcrumb trail of his possessions designed to taunt him and confuse him. Robert walked faster and faster, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that was building in his chest like a physical presence. He didn't stop to collect his things or investigate further. He just wanted to get out of the forest alive and in one piece. The implications of what was happening were becoming clear. Someone was toying with him, demonstrating their control over his belongings, their access to his private space, their knowledge of his movements. Around a bend in the trail, Robert encountered a man standing in the middle of the path, blocking his way completely. The man was lean and tall, with pale skin that looked almost translucent and dark, intense eyes that seemed to look straight through him. He was smiling, but the smile was deeply unsettling, too wide, too knowing, too calculated and wrong in ways Robert couldn't quite define. "Hello, Robert," the man said calmly. Though Robert was absolutely certain he'd never met this person before in his entire life. How did the man know his name? "Did you enjoy my gift? The record player? I set it up just for you." "Who are you?" Robert demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt, trying to understand how this stranger knew his name. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this to me?" "I'm just playing a game," the man said calmly, his voice devoid of emotion or humanity. "A fun game for my own entertainment. I take one thing at a time and hide it somewhere nearby. Can you find it before you leave? Can you make it all the way out of the forest and back to your car without losing your mind?" There was something predatory in the way he spoke, something that suggested Robert's sanity was not guaranteed, that some people don't make it out sane. Robert didn't wait to hear more. He pushed past the man and ran down the trail. He expected to be chased by the man, but he wasn't. He ran for what felt like hours, until the trail finally opened up at the parking area, and he could see civilization again, buildings, roads, other people. Robert got in his car, started the engine immediately, and drove away from Stone Creek Trail without looking back. He never returned to that location. Years later, he still doesn't understand what happened. He never found out who the man was, or what his motivations were for doing what he did to Robert, or why he chose Robert specifically, or if he had done this to others. The mystery remains unsolved, and Robert has made peace with never knowing. Story 4. Alone on Medicine Mountain. Thomas Elliott was a dedicated research botanist working for a respected university in Boise, Idaho, specializing in alpine plant species and their ecological interactions in extreme environments. At 26 years old, he was exceptionally young for his position in the competitive world of academic research, but he was dedicated with almost obsessive focus, hardworking beyond what most colleagues considered healthy, and deeply passionate about his research into plant species, ecological systems, and the biodiversity of mountain ecosystems. In 1995, he decided to spend an intensive week in the mountains, studying the particular and unique flora that grew in the Medicine Mountain region, an area known for its unique and diverse ecosystem that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world, a biological treasure trove that had remained largely unexplored by modern botanists. He wanted to spend this time in solitude, immersed in his work, far from the distractions of academic life, university politics, departmental conflicts, and the competitive pressure of the academic world. This was his chance to conduct groundbreaking research that could potentially advance his entire career significantly. Thomas arrived at the mountain on a Friday afternoon in June, hiking about 5 miles from the nearest road to a suitable camping location that he'd scouted carefully during a previous research trip months earlier. He set up his tent near a small stream that ran clear and cold, choosing this location because it would provide him with access to fresh water without having to carry heavy water containers for long distances or worry about dehydration in the mountain altitude. He'd chosen a location that was both isolated and beautiful, with views of the surrounding landscape and easy access to various plant specimens and different ecological zones. He spent Friday evening cataloging the plants and flowers around his immediate vicinity with scientific precision, taking detailed notes and making sketches of the species he found, documenting everything for later analysis. Saturday morning, Thomas woke up ready to begin his research in earnest, and with enthusiasm that bordered on manic energy. He had notebooks for recording observations, cameras for documentation, specimen containers for collecting samples, scales for measuring devices for precise data collection, and all the equipment he needed to document the botanical diversity of the region comprehensively. He spent the entire day hiking through different areas of the mountain, collecting samples of plants he hadn't previously documented, and taking photographs from various angles and in different lighting conditions to create comprehensive documentation that would allow him to study the specimens later in the lab. That evening, as Thomas was preparing dinner over his camping stove, trying to focus on eating despite the altitude affecting his appetite, he heard a sound that caught his attention and made him freeze. Someone crying out in the distance, their voice carrying through the mountain air with desperate urgency. Thomas looked around his campsite, but no one was visible in the fading light of evening. The sound was coming from somewhere in the forest beyond his camp, maybe 100 yards away through dense vegetation. Without really thinking about the possible dangers or consequences of his actions or basic safety protocols, Thomas grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound into the trees, pushing through vegetation toward where he heard the voice, driven by concern for another human being. What he found was a man, sitting against a large oak tree, with his head in his hands. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with disheveled and matted hair that hadn't been properly groomed in days, and torn clothing that hung from his body. He looked absolutely terrified and in distress about something, his shoulders shaking as if he was sobbing, though he tried to suppress the sound when he heard Thomas approaching through the forest. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked carefully, approaching the stranger with caution and genuine concern, trying to assess whether the man was injured or sick. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The man looked up, and his eyes widened when he saw Thomas approaching through the darkness. "You can see me?" he asked, his voice shaking with something that sounded like disbelief. "You can actually see me?" "Of course I can see you," Thomas replied, confused by the question, and beginning to wonder if the man was mentally unwell or in some kind of shock. "You're right in front of me. Are you hurt? What's wrong?" No, the man said, standing up quickly and looking around frantically as if searching for something in the forest. "But you need to leave. You need to get out of here immediately. Now. As quickly as possible." "What's wrong?" Thomas asked. "Why do I need to leave? What's happening here?" "There's something here," the man said, his voice becoming increasingly panicked and breathless. "A woman. I don't know who she is or where she came from, but she's been following me for the past 2 days. I can't see her clearly, not really. I can see her shadow sometimes, see her movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn to look directly at her, she's gone, vanished as if she was never there. She whispers things, horrible things." His eyes darted around nervously, as if expecting to see something. "You're scaring me," Thomas said, though he was already feeling scared himself. "Where is this woman? Where is your camp? How long have you been out here?" "I don't know," the man admitted, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know where my camp is anymore. I don't even know how I got up here in the first place. I woke up 3 days ago in the forest with no memory of how I got here, and I've been trying to find my way out. But every time I think I'm heading in the right direction, I end up back where I started, and she keeps following me. She keeps getting closer." His voice was breaking with emotion. "Come to my campsite," Thomas offered, his basic human compassion overriding his fear. "We can figure out what's happening together. You'll be safe." The man followed Thomas back to the camp, moving quickly and frequently looking over his shoulder. Thomas offered him food and water, and they sat by the fire, talking through the long night. The man's name was William, and he claimed to be a wildlife photographer from Washington State who had come to Medicine Mountain to photograph wildlife and had set up his camp about a mile away. But on the second night of his trip, strange things had started happening in ways he couldn't explain. William said he'd heard whispering outside his tent at night, voices that seemed almost feminine. When he'd emerged to investigate, he'd seen a figure, feminine in shape but indistinct and difficult to focus on, standing at the edge of his campfire's light. When he'd tried to approach her and ask her questions, she'd disappeared. After that, every time he'd tried to find his way back to civilization or locate his campsite again, he'd become hopelessly lost, the forest seeming to shift and change around him. "She's not trying to hurt me, I don't think," William said, his voice becoming quieter and more contemplative, almost dreamy. "But she keeps me here. She keeps me confused and disoriented. And her voice is so sad. She keeps saying the same thing over and over again." "What does she say?" Thomas asked. "What does she keep repeating?" "She says, 'Come with me. Come down. Come to the water. Please come to the water. I'm so lonely. I need someone to join me. I've been waiting so long." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, as if something icy was touching the back of his neck and spreading through his entire body. "Don't listen to her," he said firmly. "No matter what she says, no matter how sad her voice sounds, don't go toward the water." They decided to stay awake the entire night and leave at first light, heading back to civilization together. But around 3 in the morning, William suddenly stood up without warning and started walking toward the forest, his eyes glazed over. "Where are you going?" Thomas demanded, grabbing his arm urgently. "Come back here. I can hear her," William said, his eyes glazed over and unfocused. "She's calling me. I have to go to her. She's calling me by name. She knows me." "No, you don't," Thomas said, holding on tightly to William's arm. "We agreed we'd leave at first light. Stay here with me. You're safe here." "You don't understand," William said, struggling against Thomas's grip with surprising strength. "Her voice, it's so beautiful when you listen to it closely. She's not evil. She's just so lonely, desperately lonely. She's been alone for so long. She just wants company." Thomas had to physically restrain William for the next few hours, holding him forcibly in place and trying to keep him focused and present in the moment, talking to him, keeping him engaged in conversation. Eventually, as dawn broke and the first light of the new day appeared in the sky, William came back to his senses, looking confused and terrified about what he had almost done. They packed up the campsite as quickly as they could and began hiking down the mountain. But as they walked, they kept hearing the voice. It seemed to follow them down the trail, growing fainter as they descended, but never entirely disappearing. It sounded like a woman singing a mournful song, mourning a loss, calling out names that neither Thomas nor William recognized. When they finally reached the trailhead in William's car, William turned to Thomas with tears streaming down his face. "I could have stayed," he said quietly. "If you hadn't held me back, if you'd released your grip even for a moment, I could have stayed, and maybe she wouldn't be so lonely anymore." Thomas never saw William again after that day. He completed his research using samples he'd collected on his first day and data he'd gathered from other sources and his observations. He never returned to Medicine Mountain. To this day, Thomas believes that something on that mountain, something lonely, something lost, something that had been calling out to people for years or perhaps for centuries, was trying to keep William there permanently. And he knows that if he'd hesitated even for a moment, if he'd released his grip, William would have walked down to the water, as the voice had instructed, and they both would have become part of the mountain's mystery. Story 5, The Campfire Visitor. Part 1, The Preparation. Samuel Brooks was a determined and ambitious freelance photographer specializing in nature photography and landscape imagery, spending countless hours meticulously and obsessively trying to build his professional portfolio piece by piece and establish himself as a serious, respected, and genuinely talented artist in the incredibly competitive, cutthroat, and often discouraging field of professional photography, where recognition was fleeting and opportunities were rare and hard-won. At 24 years old, ambitious almost to the point of self-destruction, and driven by an internal fire that sometimes consumed him completely to the exclusion of all else, including sleep, food, and human relationships, he was determined to build his professional portfolio with significant work and establish himself as a serious and highly respected artist in the competitive field of photography, where thousands of talented photographers competed fiercely for attention, gallery space, and recognition from critics and collectors. His entire childhood had been marked by a love of visual art. His mother, a high school art teacher, had encouraged his creativity from an early age, providing him with supplies and taking him on photography walks through the neighborhood. She had taught him how to see light, how to compose images, how to find beauty in ordinary places. But she had also warned him about the difficulty of making a living as an artist, had encouraged him to have a backup plan, a practical career to fall back on if his artistic dreams didn't materialize. Samuel had ignored that advice. His father, a successful accountant, had suggested Samuel study business or finance, suggesting that such a path would lead to stability and a good living. Samuel remembered his father's words. "Art is a luxury for people who are already rich. Don't sabotage your future for something that probably won't support you." Those words had stung, had lodged themselves in Samuel's psyche, and had become a driving force in his determination to prove his father wrong. He would make it as a photographer. He would prove that his father's pessimism was unfounded. He would become so successful that everyone would recognize his talent. His high school years had been spent photographing everything: his friends, his school, the landscape around his hometown in Pennsylvania. He had won several photography competitions, had his work featured in the school newspaper, and had been told by multiple teachers that he had genuine talent. But talent, he was learning, was not enough. The world was full of talented photographers. What was needed was not just talent, but also luck, persistence, and a willingness to sacrifice almost everything for your art. College had been a disappointment in many ways. He had attended the University of Pittsburgh, studying photography and art history, but he had found the academic approach to photography stifling and limiting. His professors wanted him to create work that made social or political statements, wanted him to challenge conventions and push boundaries. But Samuel wanted to create beautiful images, to capture the world as he saw it through his camera lens. He wanted to pursue commercial photography, landscape photography, nature photography, the kinds of work that could actually earn him money. After graduation, he had struggled for years. He had worked as a wedding photographer to pay the bills, had done commercial product photography, had shot headshots for actors, and had worked as an assistant to established photographers. None of these jobs felt like real photography. None of them felt like art. They were means to an end, ways to fund his real work, his passion project, his attempts to create portfolio pieces that would get him noticed by galleries and magazines. His work was technically proficient and showed real promise and genuine talent, but he felt it lacked something essential and crucial, that ineffable quality that transformed good photographs into extraordinary ones, that stopped viewers in their tracks and made them feel something deep and visceral and emotional. He studied the work of the masters obsessively: Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Sebastião Salgado, Annie Leibovitz, analyzing their compositions, their use of light and shadow, their ability to capture not just what things looked like, but how things felt. He spent his free time studying the masters of photography with almost religious devotion, analyzing compositions with scientific precision, experimenting with different techniques and perspectives, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with his equipment, a Canon EOS 5D Mark II that had cost him nearly 3 months of wedding photography income. His small apartment in Pittsburgh was covered with rejection letters from magazines and galleries, each one a small wound, each one reinforcing the fear that he would never make it, that his dreams were foolish and unrealistic. But he refused to give up despite the constant disappointment and the financial struggle that came with pursuing art in a market that didn't always value it or recognize quality when it saw it. His parents worried about his future constantly. His mother had stopped asking when he was going to get a real job with benefits and stability, sensing his determination and not wanting to undermine his confidence further. His father had suggested multiple times that Samuel go back to school for something more practical, perhaps business administration or engineering. His friends from high school had moved on to corporate jobs, bought houses in the suburbs, started families, and seemed generally content with their lives. But Samuel felt that he couldn't do any of those things without betraying something fundamental about himself, without accepting defeat in pursuit of his true calling. In October 2003, at a point where he was beginning to seriously question whether his dreams were realistic or just the delusions of a naive and stubborn young man who refused to accept reality and move forward with a practical life, he decided to spend a week camping in Porcupine Ridge, Pennsylvania, hoping to capture stunning images of fall foliage in its peak colors and maximum beauty, wildlife in their natural habitat going about their daily routines, and wilderness landscapes that would set his work apart from other photographers working in the same field and competing for the same galleries and publications. He had researched the location extensively over several months, spending hours online reading trip reports from other photographers and outdoor enthusiasts, studying weather patterns and historical data about autumn conditions in the region, examining other photographers' work from the area, planning his shots weeks in advance with almost obsessive detail. He had maps marked with potential vantage points. He had sketched compositions in notebooks. He had calculated what time sunrise would occur and what direction the light would come from. This trip represented his best chance yet to create a portfolio piece that could potentially launch his career from obscurity into recognition and success. He had saved money for months through wedding photography gigs that he hated, through corporate headshot sessions that bored him, through any freelance work he could find. He had invested in new equipment, a Canon EOS 5D Mark II camera body, L-series lenses, a sturdy carbon fiber tripod, neutral density filters, a high-capacity battery system for extended shooting in cold weather. He had prepared mentally for what he hoped would be a transformative week in the wilderness, where he would finally create the work that would change his life. Part 2. The Arrival. Samuel arrived at his chosen campsite on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, when the autumn colors were at their absolute peak and maximum saturation, traveling through scenic mountain roads that wound through the valleys and hilltops before finally parking his vehicle at the trailhead parking area and beginning his hike into the forest with his heavy backpack of camera equipment and camping gear. He'd selected a location about a quarter mile off the main trail in what locals called the Deep Woods area, in a small clearing surrounded by tall ancient trees that created a natural shelter from the mountain wind and allowed for interesting photographic compositions, with the ancient trees framing the clearing like natural architecture designed by nature itself. The hike in had been beautiful but challenging. The elevation gain was significant, and Samuel's body ached by the time he reached his campsite location. But the pain was good pain, the kind of physical exertion that made him feel alive and present and connected to his body and the world around him. The weather was cool but pleasant, cool enough that he needed a light jacket, but warm enough that he could work comfortably without being encumbered by heavy winter gear. And the trees were displaying their full autumn colors in all their glory, brilliant reds that looked like blood staining the forest, oranges that seemed almost neon in their intensity and artificial brightness, and golds that caught the light like coins falling from heaven, all looking almost unreal in their intensity and saturation, as if the forest had been painted by an artist with a divine palette, rather than occurring naturally through the mysterious processes of photosynthesis and chlorophyll breakdown. He set up his tent carefully with practiced efficiency, having done this hundreds of times before on his various photography expeditions to different locations, arranged his photography equipment in a secure and protected location, away from moisture and potential damage, organized his backup batteries and memory cards meticulously in waterproof cases designed specifically for outdoor use, and built a fire pit for cooking and warmth, as the evening would bring colder temperatures, and he would need heat and light to stay comfortable. His equipment was worth thousands of dollars accumulated over years of saving and investing, and he was careful to protect it from damage. As evening fell, and the light began to change into those magical golden hour tones that every photographer dreams of capturing and that last only minutes, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes of optimal light, before the sun drops below the horizon completely, Samuel prepared a simple meal of canned soup and bread from his carefully packed supplies, and then he settled by his fire to enjoy the solitude and beauty of the wilderness around him, occasionally taking test shots with his camera to capture the way the firelight played across the landscape and the trees and the surrounding forest. He experimented with different ISO settings, trying 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and aperture values, trying to capture the essence of the moment before darkness fell completely and the light became too dim to work with effectively. He took test shots of the fire, of the trees framed against the darkening sky, of the way shadows played across the forest floor. Each shot was an experiment, a test of his equipment and his artistic vision. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky one by one, and Samuel was contemplating taking some long exposure photographs of the night sky and celestial objects, planning to set up his tripod carefully on level ground and calculating exposure times and ISO settings. To capture the Milky Way's faint light, and the constellations visible this time of year, when he heard something that made his peaceful contemplation shatter completely, like glass breaking. Footsteps approaching from the direction of the main trail that shouldn't be there at this hour, when all reasonable hikers would have finished for the day. Samuel looked up immediately, startled, and immediately concerned about this interruption to his solitude and careful planning for the week. His mind already calculating how this intrusion might affect his work. He'd expected to be completely alone in this remote area, having seen no other hikers on his approach to the trail, having specifically chosen this location because of its remoteness and the low probability of encountering other people in the forest. He had selected this spot precisely because he wanted solitude. Part 3. The Stranger. The footsteps got progressively closer, crunching distinctly on the dried leaves and twigs that covered the forest floor in a regular, purposeful rhythm that suggested someone hiking deliberately toward his location with knowledge of where they were going. Samuel felt a mixture of irritation at having his solitude interrupted and concern about who would be hiking in this area at this time of evening, when most people would be finishing their hikes for the day and returning to civilization. It was dark. Why would anyone be hiking deeper into the forest? Who hikes toward danger and darkness? A man emerged from the darkness into the circle of light cast by the fire, stepping out of the black forest as if materializing from shadow itself. He appeared to be in his 50s, wearing standard camping attire that suggested long experience in the wilderness and years of hiking, carrying a backpack and a walking stick that showed signs of extensive use with wear patterns on the grip, and small notches carved into the wood, perhaps one notch for each day spent on trails, Samuel thought. His expression was pleasant enough on the surface, and he smiled when he saw Samuel by the fire, displaying teeth that looked too white and too perfect in the firelight, teeth that seemed almost artificial and prosthetic in their perfection. His demeanor seemed friendly and approachable to the young photographer, who had been alone in the forest for hours with only his thoughts for company, though something about his arrival felt wrong in ways Samuel couldn't quite articulate or explain rationally. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked casually, as if they were old acquaintances who'd planned to meet here by the fire, as if his sudden appearance from the darkness was entirely expected and normal, rather than surprising and unsettling. "I'm not interrupting anything important, am I?" His voice was smooth and practiced, the voice of someone accustomed to conversation and interaction with others, someone who spoke frequently and comfortably. But there was something odd about the way he spoke, something that suggested he was performing, rather than genuinely communicating, as if he was reciting lines from a script that he had memorized long ago. Samuel was profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of having a stranger arrive at his campsite without any warning or announcement, but he felt pressured to be polite and accommodating as his mother had raised him to be, worried about appearing rude to an older man who might be lost or in need of assistance or having some kind of emergency. "Sure," he said, gesturing to an empty spot across the fire from him, trying to smile despite the uneasiness growing in his stomach, like a dark cloud gathering on the horizon. "Make yourself comfortable." "I was just enjoying the evening." The man sat down and introduced himself as Edward, with no last name offered, and no biographical details volunteered, claiming to be a writer working on a novel set in the Pennsylvania wilderness, and was traveling through the area gathering material and inspiration for his book about mystery and terror, and the psychological breaking points of individuals isolated in remote locations far from help or rescue. They talked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 60 or 90 minutes. Casual conversation about camping and the weather, the beauty of the landscape, and the changing seasons, and what autumn meant to different people and their emotional associations. Edward was articulate and well-spoken, apparently educated, and seemed genuinely interested in Samuel's photography work. He asked detailed questions about equipment, about photographic techniques, about Samuel's artistic vision and goals. But on the surface, Edward seemed like a perfectly normal person, perhaps a bit eccentric in his choice to wander the wilderness alone as a writer gathering material, but otherwise unremarkable and harmless. Samuel found himself relaxing slightly as the conversation continued, finding Edward's interest in his work flattering and validating. But something about him made Samuel deeply uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate or explain to himself rationally, something that his subconscious mind was picking up on, even as his conscious mind was engaging in pleasant conversation. Edward's eyes never quite focused on Samuel directly during their conversation, maintaining constant eye contact, but looking through him rather than at him, as if looking at someone standing behind Samuel, rather than at Samuel himself. Instead, they seemed to look past him, at something beyond the campfire's light, as if Edward was seeing something that Samuel couldn't perceive or understand, something in the darkness beyond the fire that existed in another plane of reality. And occasionally, Edward would tilt his head, as if listening to something that Samuel couldn't hear, as if someone was speaking to him in frequencies beyond human perception, as if he was receiving information from sources invisible to Samuel. His smile remained fixed in place for the entire hour-plus of conversation, never changing, never wavering, never seeming to correspond to anything they were actually discussing, or any emotion that should have been present. When Samuel told jokes, Edward smiled. When Samuel expressed concern about weather, Edward smiled the same smile. When Samuel spoke about his photography dreams and his fears about whether he would ever make it as an artist, Edward smiled that same unchanging smile. Samuel found himself sharing more than he usually shared with strangers, talking about his parents' disappointment, his fears of failure, his deepest doubts about whether he had real talent or was just deluding himself. Edward listened attentively, occasionally asking probing questions that seemed designed to get Samuel to reveal more and more about himself. By the time the evening had progressed significantly, Samuel had told Edward things he hadn't told his closest friends. Part 4. The night after, about an hour and a half of conversation that felt far longer to Samuel, stretching into what seemed like an eternity of awkward interaction mixed with genuine engagement, Edward stood up abruptly as if responding to an internal signal or alarm that only he could hear. "Thank you for allowing me to warm myself by your fire," he said formally, his tone suddenly changing in a way that made the hair on Samuel's neck stand up, and his entire body tense with primal warning signals that screamed danger, even though he couldn't articulate why. "I should continue on my way before it gets too late, and I lose my way in the darkness of these woods. There's a trail about a quarter-mile that direction," Samuel said, pointing toward the forest with relief at the prospect of being alone again, away from this strange and unsettling man, who had somehow unsettled him deeply without doing anything overtly threatening. "It's marked with blazes. Should be easy to follow even in the dark if you have a light." Samuel was eager for the man to leave, feeling a deep instinctive need to be away from Edward, a need that transcended rational explanation. Edward nodded and walked into the darkness without another word or any farewell, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared from the forest like a ghost dissolving into mist. Samuel watched him go, feeling oddly relieved to see him leave, though he couldn't quite explain why he felt that relief so strongly, or why his body remained tense and hypervigilant, even after Edward had disappeared from sight. He waited for the sound of Edward's footsteps to fade away into the distance, listening intently for the sound to diminish and disappear completely, but it never did. Instead, the sound of footsteps seemed to circle the campsite, moving through the darkness beyond the light in a deliberate and methodical pattern, as if Edward had not continued down the trail, but instead had begun walking in circles around Samuel's camp, like a predator circling prey, before moving in for the kill. Samuel grabbed his flashlight with trembling hands and stood up, his peaceful evening shattered completely. He swept the beam across the forest, moving it in a wide arc, searching desperately for any sign of Edward or another person, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The footsteps had stopped, and there was only silence and darkness surrounding the campfire, broken only by the sound of the fire crackling and popping as wood burned and released its energy. It was as if Edward had vanished into the night completely, as if he had never been there at all, except for the lingering sense of wrongness he had left behind, like a stain on Samuel's consciousness. Samuel was deeply unsettled and disturbed by what had just occurred, his mind struggling to make sense of the events. He decided to stay awake for the night and tend his fire carefully, keeping it burning brightly to create a barrier of light between himself and the darkness of the forest, a psychological protection even if it offered no physical defense against whatever might be out there. He gathered as much firewood as he could find in the darkness, working efficiently despite his fear, piling it near the fire pit, and arranging it so he could feed the fire through the long hours of darkness. He sat by the fire, his camera forgotten beside him, and waited for morning to come, listening to every sound and trying to determine if Edward was still nearby. The night seemed impossibly long. Samuel checked his watch repeatedly, watching the minutes crawl by at what seemed like an impossibly slow pace. He tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps Edward had simply continued down the trail, and the echo of his footsteps had made it sound like he was circling the campsite. Perhaps his own fear and anxiety had created the illusion of circling footsteps. Perhaps he was more exhausted from the hike than he realized, and was imagining things. But none of these rationalizations felt true. He knew what he had heard. Around midnight, after hours of tense waiting and listening, he heard something that made his blood run cold, in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Something that confirmed his worst fears. A voice, whispering just outside his tent, speaking in a tone that was almost seductive in its urgency and desperation and hunger. It was Edward's voice unmistakably, but it sounded different than it had before. Hollow, empty, without any life or vitality or human warmth or genuine emotion. It was saying Samuel's name, over and over again, in a tone that was neither threatening nor friendly in any conventional sense, just persistent and relentless, like a recording playing on repeat, like a ghost calling to the living from beyond the veil between worlds. "Samuel, Samuel, Samuel," the voice whispered over and over, and Samuel found himself unable to stop listening, even though every instinct screamed at him to cover his ears and block out the sound. The repetition was hypnotic, almost entrancing in its mechanical precision, as if the voice wasn't coming from a human throat, but from some kind of mechanism or device designed specifically to repeat his name over and over. Samuel grabbed his flashlight with shaking hands and unzipped the tent flap, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the task, his fingers clumsy with fear and adrenaline. There was nothing outside. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers that cast a dull red light across the clearing, creating strange shadows that seemed to move and shift and dance. The forest was dark and silent, except for the voice, which continued to whisper his name, floating on the wind like something incorporeal and impossible, like the voice of someone who existed between worlds and could not fully manifest in the physical reality that Samuel inhabited. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire burning continuously throughout the long hours until dawn broke, gathering more firewood whenever it began to burn down, moving mechanically through the motions of feeding the fire like an automaton, his mind partially disconnected from his body as a defense mechanism against the horror of the situation. He didn't leave his campsite, didn't try to escape or flee into the forest, but he felt the presence of something in the forest beyond his light, something that was watching him intently, something that was waiting for him to make a mistake, to let the fire go out, to fall asleep and become vulnerable to whatever horror awaited in the darkness. As dawn broke, and the first light of morning began to penetrate the forest with golden rays that seemed almost holy in their beauty and warmth, the whispering stopped, as if it had been switched off by some invisible force. Samuel felt the presence retreat, receding into the forest like a tide going out, leaving him exposed and shaking on the beach of his campsite. He was alive. He had survived the night, but he was changed, shaken in ways he couldn't fully comprehend or articulate. Part 5. The Decision. Samuel packed up his entire campsite immediately without eating breakfast, gathering his equipment and belongings as quickly as he could manage with hands that still trembled from exhaustion and terror, not bothering with his usual careful procedures or proper breakdown of equipment. He wanted to leave right away, to run down the trail and never look back, but his photographer's instinct, that part of him that was driven to create, to capture, to document, to prove his worth through images, told him to at least try to get some good images of the sunrise and the landscape before departing. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life, a decision that would haunt him in dreams and quiet moments for decades to come, a decision that would define the rest of his existence. As Samuel was setting up his camera equipment on a tripod, calculating the proper exposure settings and angle to capture the sunrise in all its glory, Edward appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was standing perfectly still, watching Samuel with that same empty expression that had so disturbed him the night before. His smile hadn't changed. His posture was unnaturally rigid and stiff, like a statue or a mannequin rather than a living human being. The way he stood suggested he hadn't moved all night, that he had been standing at the edge of the clearing watching Samuel throughout the entire night, as he sat by the fire, a silent sentinel observing prey, waiting for the moment to strike. "I'm leaving," Samuel said firmly, his heart pounding in his chest with renewed terror at the sight of Edward standing motionless at the forest's edge. "I'm getting out of here." Samuel's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his backpack or operate his camera equipment. "Of course," Edward replied, his voice still hollow and lifeless, devoid of any human emotion or connection to the world or to any living thing. "I was just making sure you were all right, making sure you survived the night without hurting yourself or doing something foolish in the darkness." "Survived?" Samuel questioned. confused by the phrasing and what it might imply about the nature of the danger he had faced. "There are things in these woods," Edward said, his gaze never wavering from Samuel's face, his eyes boring into Samuel's with an intensity that was almost physical, almost tangible. "Things that don't like visitors, things that wait in the dark and pull people into the darkness with them, things that feed on human fear and desperation and loneliness. I was protecting you. My presence kept them away. Without me, you would have been taken." "That doesn't make any sense," Samuel said, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound brave and rational and logical and grounded in reality. "No," Edward agreed, tilting his head at an unnatural angle that seemed to defy human physiology and the normal range of motion for a human neck. "It doesn't. That's why people don't believe. That's why people die in these woods, why their bodies are never found, why they simply disappear. They don't believe until it's too late, until they're already caught in the darkness." Samuel didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed his camera and his backpack and started walking rapidly toward the trail, his movements jerky and uncoordinated from exhaustion and fear, not bothering to pack his equipment properly or turn off his campfire. He expected Edward to follow him, to pursue him through the forest like a predator chasing prey, but he didn't. When Samuel looked back, Edward was gone, vanished as if he had never existed, or was perhaps something that had never been fully present in the material world to begin with. Samuel didn't stop walking until he reached the trailhead, emerging from the forest with tears streaming down his face, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. He never did download the photographs from that night. To this day, he refuses to even touch that particular memory card. He knows that Edward is somehow trapped in those images, waiting to be released into the world if the photos are ever viewed. He keeps the memory card locked away in a safe deposit box at his bank, and he has left instructions in his will that it should be destroyed upon his death, burned to ensure that Edward can never escape into the physical world. Epilogue. Life after Samuel still works as a freelance photographer, his career having eventually taken off through persistence and talent and luck. Though it took him years longer than he had hoped, he eventually found success shooting for outdoor magazines, eventually had his landscape work exhibited in galleries, eventually built the reputation he had dreamed of as a young man. But the success feels hollow. Feels like it came too late, feels like it came at a cost he didn't want to pay. He no longer camps alone in remote areas, and he no longer ventures into wilderness alone at all. He travels with groups now, staying close to other people, uncomfortable with solitude in ways that he can't explain to others who don't understand. He avoids Pennsylvania, avoids hiking trails that wind deep into forests far from civilization. His life has become smaller in many ways, more constrained, more limited by his fear and trauma. He has been to therapy to deal with his trauma from that night. Therapists have suggested that he experienced some kind of psychological break, that he was hallucinating or suffering from a dissociative episode brought on by exhaustion and stress. But Samuel knows what he experienced was real. He can still hear Edward's voice whispering his name. He can still see Edward's empty smile and two perfect teeth. He can still feel the presence of something watching him from the darkness beyond the firelight. Sometimes, late at night when he's editing photographs in his home, he thinks he hears that whisper, "Samuel, Samuel, Samuel," and he has to remind himself that he escaped, that Edward is still in that forest, still waiting for someone new to sit by a campfire and listen to his invitation. He checks his locked doors. He keeps lights on. He avoids being alone when possible. Years later, he met another photographer at a gallery opening who had experienced something similar in a different forest, in a different state. They recognized something in each other's eyes, a knowing, a trauma, a shared understanding of something that shouldn't exist but does. They don't talk about their experiences, but they nod at each other with recognition and silent agreement that some things are better left undiscussed, some doors better left unopened, some memories better left in darkness where they belong. Story 6. Where the Trail Ends. Complete 100. Story 6. Where the Trail Ends. Part 1. The Breaking Point. Patrick Sullivan was a middle-aged manager at a shopping center in New Jersey, a job that was slowly and methodically crushing his spirit and sense of purpose, with each passing day in ways that he couldn't fully articulate to anyone around him without sounding ungrateful or unstable. At 29 years old, though he often felt far older due to the weight of his responsibilities and disappointments, he felt like his life was passing him by with alarming and terrifying speed. stuck in an endless cycle of work and home, nothing particularly exciting or remarkable about his existence, no sense of purpose or direction or meaning in his daily activities. His days blended together in an undifferentiated gray mass of monotony and unfulfilled potential that stretched before him like an endless highway with no visible exit ramps. He managed retail operations at the Northbrook Shopping Center, handling tenant complaints from frustrated store owners, maintaining parking lots and common areas, dealing with security issues and occasional shoplifting incidents, managing a small staff of part-time workers who viewed their jobs as temporary stepping stones to better things. None of it felt meaningful or significant. None of it contributed to the world in any positive way. He was essentially a caretaker for a dying institution. The shopping center itself was struggling as online retail continued to grow and customers stayed away. His colleagues seemed content with their lives, seemed satisfied with their paychecks and their health insurance and their retirement plans, seemed not to need anything more than the security and stability that their jobs provided. But Patrick felt a deep sense of dissatisfaction that grew stronger with each passing year, a sense that he was wasting his one finite and irreplaceable life on something meaningless and temporary. He would die someday, and what would he have accomplished? He would have managed a shopping center. He would have dealt with minor conflicts and solved trivial problems. He would have filled 40 hours every week with work that anyone could do. His childhood had been different. He had grown up in rural Maine, in a small town surrounded by forests and mountains. His parents had been outdoor enthusiasts, hikers, campers, fishermen. His father had taken him on camping trips starting when he was 5 years old. They had hiked mountains together, had caught trout in cold streams, had sat around campfires under star-filled skies and talked about life and dreams and possibilities. His father had died when Patrick was 17, a heart attack while working in the garage at home, and Patrick had never fully recovered from that loss. After his father's death, Patrick had retreated from the outdoor world that they had shared. It was too painful to go camping without his father, too sad to hike mountains they had planned to climb together, too difficult to face the wilderness that held so many memories of his lost parent. He had thrown himself into his studies instead, had focused on getting good grades and going to a good college, had tried to build a practical future. In college at the University of New Hampshire, he had majored in business administration because it seemed practical and marketable, because it would lead to stable employment and a comfortable middle-class life. His mother had been relieved that he was choosing a practical major instead of pursuing environmental science or outdoor recreation, as he had initially considered. "You need to think about your future," she had said. "You need to build a stable career that will support you." After graduation, he had taken the job at the shopping center, thinking it was temporary, thinking it would be a stepping stone to something better. But temporary had become permanent. 3 years had turned into 6 years, had turned into 8 years. He was 29 years old, and he felt like his life was already over, like he had failed at the one task that mattered, living a meaningful life. He thought about his father often, thought about the conversations they had had on those camping trips, thought about his father's wisdom and experience and love. His father would have been disappointed in him, Patrick sometimes thought. His father had wanted him to pursue his passions, had told him that a life spent doing work you didn't believe in was a wasted life. "Don't make my mistakes," his father had said on one of their last camping trips. "I spent 40 years working in a job that paid the bills but never made me happy. Don't do the same thing. Life is too short." Part 2. The Decision. In 1997, at a point where he felt he could no longer bear the weight of his mundane existence without literally dying inside, he decided he needed to break the pattern of his life before it was too late, before he became one of those middle-aged men who looked back on his youth with regret, and nothing but regret. He took a 2-week vacation that he had been saving for years, vacation time that his employer had suggested he use or lose, and decided to go hiking in New Hampshire, specifically choosing Blackwater Trail, a remote hiking route known throughout the hiking community for its difficulty, isolation from civilization, and the challenging terrain that separated it from more popular and well-maintained trails. He had read about Blackwater Trail in hiking magazines, had seen photographs of the dramatic scenery, waterfalls and overlooks and pristine wilderness, and had decided that this would be his opportunity to do something daring and adventurous, something that would make him feel alive for the first time in years, something that would reconnect him with the person he had been before his father's death. He wanted to prove something to himself, wanted to test himself against the wilderness, wanted to face fear and overcome it. Patrick had done some hiking before during his teenage years and college break periods, had hiked with his father as a child, but nothing like Blackwater Trail. The trail was challenging and demanding according to all accounts, requiring significant endurance and extensive hiking experience that Patrick wasn't entirely certain he possessed after years of sitting at a desk and dealing with minor administrative tasks. But he was determined, driven by a desperate need to prove something to himself, to prove that he wasn't just going to accept a mediocre existence without at least trying to do something extraordinary. He prepared carefully for months, methodically and obsessively. He trained for endurance by running 3 miles every morning before work, cycling on weekends, doing stair climbing at a local gym to build leg strength. He studied maps of the trail in exhaustive detail, reading trip reports from other hikers, learning about the terrain and the elevation gains and the water crossings. He purchased quality equipment, a new backpack, a high-quality tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, cooking equipment, a detailed topographic map, a compass that he learned to use properly, and eventually a GPS unit, which was then cutting-edge technology that few hikers possessed. He spent weeks planning his route, calculating daily mileage, determining where he would camp each night, figuring out how much food he would need to pack. He consulted with rangers at the New Hampshire Department of Natural Resources, who warned him about the difficulty and remoteness of the trail. One ranger specifically warned him about getting lost, about the trail being poorly marked in some sections, about the dangers of hiking alone in remote wilderness. On a Friday morning in late summer, Patrick drove north from New Jersey to New Hampshire, drove to the Blackwater Trail parking area, and began his adventure with a sense of excitement and purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He was doing this. He was finally doing something meaningful. He was breaking free from the gray cycle of his existence. Part 3. The Trail. The first few days were difficult but manageable, as Patrick pushed himself hard, covering good distances each day and camping each night in designated areas along the trail as he had planned. Everything was going according to plan. He was making good progress toward the northern terminus of the trail, moving steadily upward through significant elevation gains and across terrain that challenged him physically but made him feel more alive than he had felt in years. The struggle was validating. The exhaustion was real and honest and meaningful. The accomplishment of each day felt genuine and significant in ways that his job never had. He saw beautiful vistas from the overlooks. He crossed streams. He hiked through forests of birch and spruce and fir trees. He was connecting with nature in the way his father had taught him to do, was finding peace and meaning in the wilderness. On the second night, he sat by his campfire and cried for his dead father, cried for the years he had wasted in meaningless work, cried with a sense of release and catharsis. But on the 4th day, something strange and unsettling started happening that Patrick couldn't quite explain or rationalize away with logical thinking. Patrick would encounter other hikers on the trail, men mostly, of various ages and appearances, each one alone or in small groups. Each would be cordial enough when they met, greeting Patrick and asking questions about his trip, where he had come from, where he was going, how long he had been on the trail. But each encounter left Patrick with an inexplicable sense of unease and dread that grew stronger with each meeting, a dread that his conscious mind couldn't explain, but his body understood instinctively. There was something off about these people, something fundamentally unsettling about their demeanor and behavior that Patrick couldn't quite identify. They all had the same kind of blank expression on their faces, as if they were wearing masks or had their faces frozen in place. They all asked the same kinds of questions in the same order, as if following a script that they had memorized, and they all seemed to be hiking in the opposite direction from where Patrick was going, heading back down the mountain, even though Patrick was on a trail that was supposed to lead to the northern terminus at the top of the mountain. On the 5th day, Patrick met a hiker who introduced himself as George, a name that seemed almost generic and forgettable, as if it wasn't a real name but a placeholder or a default name. They talked for a while in the shade of a large tree, and George mentioned casually that he'd been hiking the Blackwater Trail for 3 weeks. Patrick's heart had skipped a beat when he heard this. According to the guidebook and all his research, the entire trail could be completed in about 8 days of rigorous hiking, 10 days maximum for someone moving more slowly and taking more time to enjoy the views. 3 weeks made no sense unless something was very wrong. 3 weeks? Patrick asked, his voice filled with concern and confusion, his stomach dropping. How is that possible? I've been hiking for 5 days and I'm almost halfway through according to my calculations and my map. The trail loops back on itself, George explained in a monotone voice that lacked inflection or genuine emotion, a voice that sounded rehearsed and mechanical. Or at least, that's what it seems like. You think you're making progress toward the end, but then you find yourself back where you started. I've been trying to get out for 2 weeks now. I keep thinking I'm close to the northern terminus, but I'm never close. I always end up back at the beginning somehow. George's eyes seemed unfocused, looking past Patrick rather than at him, looking at something in the distance that Patrick couldn't see. Patrick felt a chill run down his spine, and his stomach seemed to drop several inches. Have you contacted the rangers? Are there other hikers stuck like this? His voice sounded strange and distant to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking. There are others, George said, his voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. I see them sometimes. Different people, but they're all stuck. They're all just walking in circles, following the trail, never reaching the end. We pass each other sometimes on the trail and acknowledge each other's presence, but we don't really talk. What's the point of talking when we're all trapped? Patrick wanted to believe that George was exaggerating or confused, perhaps suffering from dehydration or altitude sickness, or some kind of mental breakdown caused by the stress of extended hiking and isolation. But something in the man's eyes, a kind of hopelessness, a kind of resignation that came from repeated failure and defeat, a kind of acceptance that his situation was unchangeable and permanent, made Patrick believe him despite the impossibility of what he was saying. This man had been lost for weeks and had apparently given up hope of ever escaping. He was resigned to his fate, accepting it as unchangeable reality. Part 4. The Confusion. That night, Patrick checked his GPS unit carefully with trembling hands, hoping for reassurance from the device's objective data and technological accuracy. According to his calculations, he should be making steady progress northward, and the GPS coordinates suggested he was indeed moving in the right direction and making progress toward his goal. But when he looked at the trail on his topographic map, something seemed fundamentally wrong and off in ways he couldn't quite identify or articulate clearly. He wasn't quite sure what it was, but the terrain didn't seem to match what the map indicated. The scale seemed wrong somehow. The distances didn't add up correctly in his calculations. The landmarks he was seeing didn't correspond to the landmarks marked on his map. He tried to use his compass to orient himself, to figure out which direction was north, but the compass seemed unreliable, spinning sometimes before settling on a direction. He recalibrated it multiple times, but it kept giving him inconsistent readings. Either the compass was malfunctioning, or the magnetic properties of this location were somehow disrupted or unusual in ways he didn't understand. That night, Patrick barely slept. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, wondering if he was lost, wondering if what George had told him was true, wondering if he was trapped in some kind of loop that he couldn't escape. He checked his GPS unit repeatedly throughout the night, checking his position, trying to understand what was happening. The next morning, after a night of restless sleep filled with strange dreams of endless trails and impossible landscapes, where he kept finding himself back where he started, Patrick made a calculated decision to turn around and head back toward the southern terminus of the trail where he had started. If the trail was somehow looping or confusing as George had claimed, it would be better to head back to a known starting point and regroup, rather than to continue forward into uncertainty and potential danger. He would get his bearings, figure out what was happening, and then decide on a new plan. But as Patrick walked back along the trail heading toward where he had started, he began to encounter more hikers, and each one told him essentially the same story with minor variations. They'd been trying to hike the trail, and they'd become confused. The trail didn't lead where they expected it to. They kept ending up back where they started. The trail seemed to shift and change. They were all trapped. Some had been trapped for days, some for weeks. And one man, an older hiker named Robert who looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks, claimed to have been hiking the same loop for over a month, unable to find the way out. Robert was thin and gaunt, his clothes hanging on his frame, his eyes hollow and haunted. He told Patrick that he had tried everything, leaving the trail and bushwhacking through the forest, leaving markers and signs to track his position, using his GPS unit, using a compass, even trying to go back down the mountain at night when he thought he might see the lights of civilization in the distance, but nothing worked. Every attempt to escape the trail resulted in him ending up back where he started. "The trail doesn't want to let us go," Robert said, and there was a tone in his voice that suggested he had made peace with his situation, that he had accepted his fate as permanent and unchangeable. "I don't know what it is or why it's happening, but this place has rules that don't make sense by normal standards. It's like the trail exists in a space that's separate from normal reality, and we're trapped in that space." By the afternoon of the 6th day, Patrick was convinced he was in genuine danger, and that something very wrong was happening in this place, something that transcended normal explanation and rational thought. He was terrified. He was lost. He didn't know how to escape. His GPS unit was giving him conflicting information. His compass was unreliable, and every attempt to find his way out had resulted in him finding himself back where he started. He used his phone, which miraculously still had cell service despite being in a remote wilderness area, to call the New Hampshire Rangers with shaking hands, and reported his situation in detail, trying to explain what was happening without sounding insane. The ranger he spoke to seemed confused and deeply skeptical by his account, and didn't seem to believe what Patrick was telling him. According to the ranger's knowledge and experience, the Blackwater Trail was a straightforward trail with clear markings and well-maintained sections. It didn't loop back on itself. There should be no confusion about direction or progress for an experienced hiker with proper equipment and a GPS unit. The ranger asked Patrick to describe his current location in exhaustive detail. Patrick provided specific details about the terrain, the trees, the landmarks he could see, and the elevation he was at according to his GPS unit, providing exact coordinates. The ranger said that according to the map and GPS coordinates Patrick provided, he should be only about 2 miles from the northern terminus of the trail, practically at his destination. Patrick insisted he'd only been hiking for 6 days and had made what he calculated to be about 15 miles of progress, not enough to reach the end if the trail was as long as the guidebook claimed it should be. "That doesn't match," the ranger said, his skepticism evident in his tone and his words. "If you've been hiking the Blackwater Trail for 6 days, you should have reached the terminus by now. There's no way your current location is correct. Your GPS might be malfunctioning. Your calculations might be wrong. You might be misreading your map." Part 5. The Desperation. Patrick began to panic as the ranger's skepticism added another layer of uncertainty and fear to his already fragile mental state and his sense of reality. He looked at his GPS unit again with growing dread. The coordinates seemed clear and readable, but when he tried to correlate them with his map and the physical landscape around him, nothing matched. It was as if his GPS was reading coordinates from a different world than the one he was actually standing in, from some parallel reality that didn't quite align with objective reality. The ranger advised Patrick to stay where he was, and assured him that a search and rescue team would be dispatched to come find him and help extract him from his current situation. Patrick waited anxiously for hours, sitting by his campfire, watching the trail, waiting for rescue. But no rescue team appeared. The sun began to set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest, and Patrick realized that no one was coming. Either the ranger hadn't believed him enough to initiate a rescue, or there was something about this location that prevented rescue from being possible. Patrick set up his tent with growing dread and desperation, terrified and confused and exhausted. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by his campfire, listening to the forest, wondering what was happening, wondering if he would ever escape this place. That night, Patrick made a desperate decision that showed how far his rational mind had deteriorated under the stress and fear and confusion. He would leave the trail entirely and bushwhack directly west, using his compass toward a highway he could see on his map, about 8 miles away through difficult forest terrain. He didn't care if it was difficult or dangerous. He just wanted to get out of this place and escape whatever was happening to the trail. He would forge his own path, rather than follow the cursed trail that seemed determined to keep him trapped. But when Patrick tried to navigate directly west using his compass and attempting to move in a straight line through the forest, he found that the landscape would not cooperate with his plans or his attempts to escape. Valleys appeared where he expected hills, forcing him to descend when he should have been ascending. Steep cliff faces blocked his path and forced him to backtrack repeatedly, wasting hours of effort and energy. Dense forests of seemingly impenetrable vegetation prevented him from making any progress in a straight line, despite his exhausting efforts. It was as if the mountain itself was redirecting him, forcing him back toward the trail, pushing him toward an unknown destination or purpose, as if the mountain had its own agency and will. After hours of struggling through dense forest and scrambling over rocks and fallen trees, Patrick found himself back on the trail exactly where he had started his bushwhacking attempt. It was as if his hours of effort and exhausting struggle had accomplished nothing, had moved him backward in time and space, had negated all his attempts to escape. Part 6. The Acceptance. On the 7th day, after exhausting attempts to escape, that only resulted in him finding himself back where he started, Patrick finally gave up his attempt to force his way off the mountain. His body was exhausted. His mind was broken. He was out of food. His carefully calculated rations had been consumed more quickly than planned, due to his constant attempts at escape. He returned to the trail in defeat and sat down in despair, his body and mind broken by the experience, his will to continue eroded by repeated failure. That's when he saw another hiker approaching. A woman this time, probably in her 60s with gray hair and weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much sadness and too much suffering. She recognized the look in Patrick's eyes immediately, having seen it in the eyes of every trapped hiker on this cursed mountain. "You're trying to escape," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Patrick nodded, unable to speak, unable to articulate the depth of his despair. "Don't bother," she said, sitting down next to him. "I've been here for 5 years. I've tried everything. I've tried bushwhacking in every direction. I've tried following different branches of the trail. I've tried running at night when I couldn't see where I was going. I've tried leaving the trail and moving through the forest. I've tried everything a human being can think of, and nothing works. We're stuck here." Patrick didn't ask how that was possible. He was past the point of being surprised by anything. The normal rules of reality seemed not to apply in this place. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We walk," the woman said. "That's all we can do. We walk the trail, over and over again, and we hope that eventually we'll reach the end. Some people give up and just camp in place, but the trail keeps calling you, keeps pulling you forward. We walk. It's what we do." Patrick spent another week on the trail, walking in circles, meeting other trapped hikers, trying to maintain his sanity in an impossible situation. He kept detailed notes of his position and distance traveled, looking for patterns or anomalies, trying to understand the logic of his imprisonment. He mapped the trail in his notebook, trying to figure out the exact loop, trying to understand the geographical anomaly that was keeping him trapped. Other hikers told him their stories. A businessman from Boston, who had been hiking for 3 weeks. A college student from Massachusetts who had been on the trail for 2 weeks. An older man from Vermont who claimed to have been hiking for 6 months, though he looked like he had aged 10 years in that time. Each one had a story of becoming confused, of the trail not leading where it should, of becoming trapped in a loop that they couldn't escape. Part 7. The Escape. But on the 14th day, after 2 weeks of being trapped in this impossible place, after 14 days of walking in circles and encountering the same hikers repeatedly, and finding himself back at the same campsites, Patrick rounded a corner on the trail and found himself suddenly back at the southern terminus of the trail, at the parking area where he'd started his journey. His car was still there, exactly where he'd left it, covered in dust from 2 weeks of sitting idle in the sun and rain and wind. For a moment, Patrick wondered if he had imagined the whole thing, if it was all a hallucination or a mental breakdown, or some kind of shared delusion experienced with other hikers who weren't actually real. But he knew what he had experienced was real. He had the journal entries to prove it. He had lost weight from eating only what food he could find or trade with other hikers. His clothes were torn and muddy. His feet were covered with blisters and sores. He was sunburned and exhausted and traumatized in ways that couldn't be faked or imagined. Patrick drove away from the trail and never looked back. He tried to report his experience to the rangers, but they insisted that everything he'd described was impossible and irrational. The trail wasn't a loop. It didn't trap hikers. It was a straightforward trail that thousands of people hiked successfully every year without any problems. They suggested he might be suffering from some kind of dissociative disorder or psychological trauma that had caused him to misinterpret his experience in ways that made no sense. Patrick never hiked again. To this day, decades later, he doesn't know if he was genuinely lost in some kind of supernatural location, if he was experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown or shared delusion with other hikers who experienced similar symptoms, or if he'd somehow stepped into a place where the normal rules of geography and physics no longer applied. He doesn't know if the other hikers were real, or if they were projections of his confused and traumatized mind, manifestations of his fear and desperation taking human form, and he doesn't know if anyone else is still stuck on that trail, walking in circles, hoping to find an exit that might not exist. He sometimes thinks he should go back and try again, that he should try to help the woman and the others he met, that he should attempt to investigate what happened and understand the nature of the trap, but fear and trauma keep him away. The Blackwater Trail remains a forbidden place in his mind, a location he will never willingly approach again. He moved back to Maine, back to his hometown, back to the place where his father had died and where his childhood memories lived. He quit his job at the shopping center. He took work as a hiking guide, leading groups on well-marked trails in areas where he felt safe. He reconnected with nature in the way his father would have wanted him to, but he never went back to Blackwater Trail, and he never went hiking alone again. Story 7. The Disappearing Act, Part 1. The Accountant's Escape. Victor Reeves was a quiet, methodical, and intensely private man who kept to himself and actively avoided unnecessary social interaction with colleagues, neighbors, and most people in general. At 31 years old, he worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Portland, Maine called Harrison & Associates, a career path that was intellectually demanding but profoundly emotionally draining in ways that sapped his mental energy and left him feeling hollow at the end of each working day. He had chosen accounting as a career precisely because it was solitary work, analyzing numbers, reconciling accounts, finding discrepancies in financial statements, work that required focus and precision, but didn't require him to engage with people or build relationships or navigate complex social dynamics. His childhood had been difficult in ways that had shaped him fundamentally. His father had been an alcoholic, prone to violent outbursts and emotional abuse. His mother had been withdrawn and depressed, unable or unwilling to protect him from his father's temper. Victor had learned early on to make himself small and quiet, to avoid drawing attention, to survive by being invisible. He had spent much of his childhood in his room, reading books and doing homework, creating a private world where he could escape the chaos of his family home. As an adult, Victor had maintained that same strategy of invisibility and withdrawal. He lived alone in a small apartment in Portland, drove to work and home every day, without talking to anyone, ate lunch alone at his desk, and spent his evenings reading or watching television. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships, no hobbies that involved other people. His life was carefully controlled and compartmentalized, structured to minimize unpredictability and human interaction. His colleagues at the accounting firm viewed him as competent but unremarkable. He did his job well, produced accurate work, met all his deadlines, but he never participated in office social events or happy hours. He didn't join the firm's softball team or the annual company retreat. He was polite but distant, present but absent, in all the ways that mattered for building human connection. He had done some camping before, though not for many years. In college, he had taken an outdoor recreation class as an elective, had learned basic camping skills, had gone on a few camping trips with classmates. But those were group experiences that he had tolerated rather than enjoyed. After college, he had not camped again for 12 years, had put that part of his life away and forgotten about it. But in 2004, something shifted in Victor. He turned 31 years old, and the milestone forced him to confront the reality of his life. He was alone. He was disconnected from the world. He was not living. He was merely existing, going through the motions of life without actually participating in it. He looked at the years stretching ahead of him, decades of the same routine, the same isolation, the same emptiness, and something inside him broke. He began thinking about camping again, about those college trips, about the feeling of being in nature and away from civilization. He thought about the simplicity of it, the way that camping stripped away all the social complexity and left you alone with yourself and the natural world. He didn't want company or guidance. He wanted solitude. He wanted to escape. He wanted to feel something besides the numbness and emptiness that had become his default emotional state. In September 2004, he took a week off from work and decided to go camping for the first time in over a decade. He purchased new camping equipment, a modern tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, a backpack, and drove to the Saddleback Mountains in Maine. He chose this location specifically because it was remote and relatively unpopular with tourists. He wanted to be completely alone. Part 2. The Encounter. On the second day of his trip, Victor encountered another hiker on the trail, a man who introduced himself as David. David was older, probably in his 50s, with a weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor experience. and an easy, friendly demeanor that immediately made Victor feel unexpectedly comfortable, which was unusual for Victor, who typically felt uncomfortable around strangers. "First time in these mountains?" David asked casually, as they stood on the trail, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. "Yeah," Victor replied, surprised to find himself actually engaging in conversation. "Just looking for some peace and quiet away from the city." Victor's answers were typically monosyllabic when forced into social interaction, but something about David's manner invited slightly more communication. "Well, you'll find that here," David said, gesturing to the surrounding wilderness. "It's a beautiful area. Not many people venture this far in. Have you found the shelter yet? The place where you were planning to stay?" David's knowledge of the area was impressive, his familiarity with the mountain suggesting he had hiked here many times before. "There's supposed to be one about 5 miles north," Victor said, consulting his map that he had been studying obsessively, trying to plot the most efficient route through the wilderness. He had even marked his planned campsites with a highlighter. "Actually, there's one much closer," David said, his smile widening. "Just a couple miles east from here. I know exactly where it is. If you'd like, I could show you. It's a great shelter, much better condition than the one you're planning to go to. More protected from the wind, closer to a water source, better established fire pit." David's offer was so reasonable, so helpful, so genuinely well-intentioned sounding. Victor was hesitant about leaving the main trail, about deviating from his carefully planned route, but David seemed friendly enough, and the idea of a well-maintained shelter sounded appealing. Victor's planned shelter was supposed to be more basic, potentially more exposed to the elements. What harm could it do to check out this alternative location? "Sure," Victor agreed. "That sounds good." Part 3. The Trap. David led Victor off the main trail, following what appeared to be a less traveled path that was still reasonably clear and marked. They hiked for what Victor estimated to be about 2 miles, moving through increasingly dense forest. The trail became less distinct, more overgrown. Victor began to feel increasingly uneasy, his instincts sending warning signals even though David's manner remained friendly and his explanations were reasonable. Then David announced they'd arrived at the shelter. But what Victor saw was only a small, ramshackle structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. It was falling apart, with a sagging roof that looked ready to collapse, walls that were rotting in places, the interior dark and damp and uninviting. It wasn't a shelter at all. It was a ruin, a derelict structure that had been left to decay. "This is it?" Victor asked, trying to hide his disappointment and growing concern. "This doesn't look safe. I don't think I can stay here." His initial caution about leaving the trail had been vindicated. He had made a mistake in trusting this stranger. "No, I don't think so," David said, and suddenly his tone had changed completely, transforming from friendly to something harder and colder. "I don't think you can stay here." His hand moved deliberately to a knife at his belt, his fingers wrapping around the handle in a way that suggested familiarity and practice. His face had changed too. His expression had shifted from friendly to predatory, his eyes now showing a completely different personality than the one he had been projecting. Victor's heart began to race with intense fear. His survival instincts, honed in childhood, immediately recognized danger. He turned and started running back the way they'd come, not bothering to follow the trail, just pushing through the forest in the direction he thought was back toward civilization. Behind him, he could hear David crashing through the underbrush, following with clear intent to catch him or hurt him or worse. Part 4. The lost Victor ran for what felt like hours, driven by pure adrenaline and fear and the primal need to survive. Eventually, he managed to lose David in the dense forest by circling back and moving in unexpected directions. He continued running until he was absolutely certain he was no longer being pursued, and then he collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, his legs shaking with exhaustion, and his entire body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. After resting for a while and trying to calm his racing heart, Victor tried to find his way back to the main trail, but no matter which direction he went, he couldn't seem to find it. The forest looked all the same, endless trees, no distinguishing landmarks, no trail markers, nothing to orient himself by. Victor pulled out his map and tried to figure out where he was, but without being able to see the sun clearly through the dense canopy or any distinctive features of the landscape, it was impossible to determine his location. He stumbled through the forest for hours, growing increasingly desperate and panicked with each passing moment. The forest seemed endless, seemed designed to confound and disorient anyone trying to navigate through it. He tried moving downhill, thinking water would lead him to civilization. He tried moving in cardinal directions using the sun when visible. He tried backtracking his path. Nothing worked. He was well and truly lost. Finally, as evening was falling, and the forest was becoming darker and more threatening, Victor heard the sound of voices. He moved toward the sound, and found a small clearing where there was a campfire and several people sitting around it. Victor approached cautiously, and found himself looking at a group of about 10 people, all of whom looked like they'd been lost in the forest for a very long time. They were thin and worn, their clothing tattered and torn, their faces hollow with hunger and exhaustion. They looked at Victor with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "You just escaped from David, didn't you?" one of them asked. A man who looked like he might be in his 60s, but could have been younger given his malnourished appearance. Victor nodded, too shocked and exhausted to speak. "He brought me here too," the man continued. I don't remember how long ago. A year? Maybe 2? After a while you stop counting the days. Time becomes meaningless when you're lost." "What does he want?" Victor asked. "He wants people," another member of the group said. "He brings people out here and hunts them. Some of us he catches. Some escape and get lost. And eventually we find them. Or they find us. We've become kind of a community of the lost. People trapped in this forest, waiting for rescue that will never come." Part 5. The Lost Community. Victor spent that night with the group, listening to their stories in the flickering light of the campfire. Each one had been lured into the mountains by David under false pretenses. Each one had tried to escape and had become hopelessly lost. Some had been in the forest for weeks, some for months, and one woman claimed to have been trapped for over a year. They shared what little food they had: nuts, berries, small game they had managed to trap. They explained the rules of survival in this cursed place. Stay near water, don't venture too far from known landmarks, avoid David if possible, though he always seemed to find people eventually, establish campsites and defend them. They had created a complex social structure among themselves to survive, sharing resources, watching out for each other, providing emotional support and companionship in the face of their shared nightmare. One man named Thomas explained that they had tried many times to escape. They had attempted to find their way out of the forest by moving in specific directions. They had tried to find the main trail. They had tried to reach the parking area. They had tried to move toward where they thought civilization was. But the forest seemed to have its own logic, its own rules. It would shift and change, presenting obstacles where none should exist, redirecting lost hikers back toward the center of the forest rather than outward toward civilization. "It's like the forest doesn't want to let us go," Thomas said. "Like something is keeping us here. I don't know if it's supernatural or psychological or what, but I know what I've experienced. I know what we've all experienced, and I know we're not getting out." Part 6. The New Plan. The next morning, Victor made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would try to find his way out, not by following the trails or landmarks, all of which seemed to lead in circles, but by following the streams. Water always flowed downhill, and eventually it would lead to a river, and eventually that river would lead to civilization and escape. It was a strategy based on logic and physics, rather than on trying to navigate through the forest's twisted geography. He followed this strategy for 2 days, using his new understanding of hydrological systems to guide his path. He followed small streams into larger streams into what became a proper creek. He moved downstream constantly, never deviating from the water's path, and miraculously, after 2 days of following the water, it seemed to actually be working. The forest began to open up. The sounds of civilization began to become audible. Distant traffic sounds, the sound of human activity. Eventually, he found a larger river and followed it for another day until he could see buildings in the distance. He'd made it to a small town at the edge of the mountains. He was alive. He was out. He had escaped the forest. Part 7. The Impossible Report. Victor immediately reported his experience to the local police and the state ranger service. He told them about David and the group of lost people in the forest. A search and rescue operation was organized, and rangers went out to investigate and attempt to locate the group of 10 people Victor had described. But when they tried to find the location Victor described, they couldn't find anything. There was no shelter, no campfire, no group of lost people. The coordinates didn't make sense. The distances were wrong. The terrain didn't align with Victor's description. It was as if the place Victor had been didn't actually exist or existed in a different spatial dimension than the one the Rangers were searching in. Victor tried to give them more specific directions, marking locations on maps, describing landmarks in detail. But the maps didn't match his recollection. The terrain didn't align with what he remembered. The forest seemed to have rearranged itself in his absence, had shifted back into a normal geographical configuration that made his experience seem impossible. Eventually, the authorities concluded that Victor had been hallucinating or fantasizing. There was no evidence of anyone named David, no evidence of lost hikers, nothing to support his story. Victor was questioned by mental health professionals who suggested he had experienced some kind of psychological break brought on by stress or trauma. The local psychiatrist suggested that Victor might be suffering from dissociative episodes or other mental health conditions. Part 8. The Aftermath. Victor left Maine and never returned. He moved to Oregon, as far away as possible from that forest. To this day, he doesn't know what really happened in those mountains. He doesn't know if David was real, if the group of lost people was real, or if he'd experienced some kind of psychological breakdown, or shared delusion with other hikers who may or may not have actually existed. But he remembers the fear, the desperation, the sense of being lost in a place that didn't follow normal rules of geography and physics. He remembers the faces of the people in the forest, their hollow eyes, their stories of being trapped. He remembers the feeling of following the stream, the hope that came with finally seeing civilization, the joy of escape. He still has nightmares about being lost in that forest. He wakes up in cold sweats, believing he's back there, that he never really escaped at all, that the past 13 years have been a hallucination or a dream, and he's still wandering in the forest looking for a way out. He has spent thousands of dollars on therapy trying to process his experience and determine what was real. He no longer works as an accountant. The structured, quiet life that once appealed to him now feels suffocating and impossible. He works as a guide for search and rescue operations, helping to find lost people in the wilderness. He volunteers extensively with organizations that assist people in crisis. He has become more social, more open, more engaged with the world around him. The trauma of his experience in the forest had paradoxically made him more human, more connected to others, more willing to engage with the world despite his fundamental nature as an introvert. But the forest still calls to him sometimes. He will be walking in a normal forest and suddenly feel a sense of wrongness, a sense that the forest is trying to pull him in, that the lost people are calling to him. He will see a place that reminds him of the cursed forest and feel his heart rate spike and his palms begin to sweat. He avoids forests now as much as possible. He stays in open areas. He avoids hiking and camping entirely. And sometimes, late at night, he hears David's voice in his mind, whispering his name over and over again, like David is still out there in the forest, still hunting, still looking for him. Victor has come to believe that David isn't fully human, isn't bound by normal rules of time and space, and could potentially reach him even here in Oregon, Story 8. Silent Footsteps. Part 1. The Breaking. Nathan Pierce was a management consultant in New York City, a career that involved endless meetings that could have been emails, tight deadlines that were artificially imposed by clients who didn't understand project complexity, and constant stress that affected every aspect of his life in destructive ways. At 27 years old, he was successful by most measures of modern capitalism and corporate achievement, but he was burnt out in ways that no vacation could fix. The job consumed his life with relentless hunger, long hours at the office that often extended until midnight, presentations to demanding clients who questioned every decision, pressure to constantly improve results and cut costs and maximize efficiency, and the knowledge that any mistake could derail his career trajectory and damage his professional reputation permanently. Nathan came from a middle-class family in Connecticut. His father was an engineer, his mother a teacher. They had instilled in him values of hard work, achievement, and success. They had pushed him toward prestigious schools and lucrative careers. They had taught him that his worth was measured by his professional accomplishments and his income level. He had internalized these values so completely that his entire sense of self was wrapped up in his job performance. In college at Yale, he had been an overachiever, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, serving as class president, participating in multiple clubs and organizations. He had gotten into Harvard Business School and had graduated near the top of his class. He had landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm and had quickly become known as someone who delivered results, who could handle any project, who could push through any obstacle through sheer force of will and determination. But by age 27, the cost of his ambition was becoming undeniable. He hadn't had a meaningful relationship in years. His last girlfriend had broken up with him because he was emotionally unavailable and never present. He didn't have close friends. His friendships had become transactional networking relationships with other ambitious professionals. He rarely saw his family beyond obligatory holiday visits. He didn't have hobbies or interests outside of work. His life was a narrow tunnel focused entirely on professional achievement. He had started having panic attacks, sudden moments when his heart would race uncontrollably, and he would feel like he was dying. He had gone to a doctor who had prescribed anti-anxiety medication, which he had tried for a week before deciding it made him feel weak, and had stopped taking. He had started drinking more than he realized. A few glasses of wine most nights, sometimes whiskey to help him sleep. His hands shook in the mornings. His stomach was constantly in knots. In 2000, at a point where he was approaching psychological and physical collapse, he decided to take a break from his high-pressure job and spend a week camping in Eagle Pass Forest in upstate New York, hoping to reconnect with himself and nature and something real and authentic that might still exist beneath the layers of ambition and professional success and corporate bullshit that had encrusted his personality. Part 2. The preparation. Nathan had been camping a few times before during college and felt confident in his abilities, despite his years away from wilderness activities. He'd taken an outdoor skills class in college, had gone camping with fraternity friends, had learned basic wilderness survival techniques. He'd chosen a remote campsite, about 8 miles from the nearest road, in an area that wasn't particularly popular with other campers, and that seemed unlikely to have cell phone service or any signs of civilization. He was looking for solitude and peace, and a break from the constant connectivity that defined modern life. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon and set up his camp carefully in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, arranging his tent in the center of the clearing with good visibility in all directions. He had purchased quality camping equipment from REI, a Coleman tent, a down sleeping bag, a MSR camping stove, all the gear recommended by the sales associate, who had assured him this equipment was professional grade. Nathan spent the evening building a fire, preparing a simple dinner of pasta and canned vegetables, and relaxing by the fire as the sun set over the mountains. It felt wonderful to be away from civilization, away from the noise and stress of the city, away from his phone and email and all the constant demands on his attention and energy. He felt his shoulders relax for the first time in months. His racing heart slowed. His anxiety decreased. Maybe this was what he needed. Part 3. The watching. That night, as Nathan was lying in his tent trying to fall asleep, he became aware of a feeling that was subtle, but increasingly persistent, a sense that something, or someone, was watching him from the darkness beyond his tent. It was a subtle feeling at first, just a vague unease and paranoia that his rational mind tried to dismiss as product of imagination and isolation and the stress of the past months. But as the night progressed and the hours passed slowly, it grew stronger and more persistent. Nathan wasn't sure if he was actually sensing something real or just imagining it due to anxiety about being alone in the wilderness miles from any help or assistance. The next morning, Nathan examined his campsite carefully and methodically, looking for any evidence of visitors or disturbance. There were no signs of any visitors, no footprints in the soft earth around his camp, no evidence of anyone or anything having been near his tent during the night, no trampled vegetation, no signs of a campfire or human presence, no broken branches that would indicate passage through the forest. Nathan tried to convince himself that it had all been in his head, anxiety from being alone in the forest, nothing more, just his mind playing tricks on him due to stress and sleep deprivation. But he wasn't entirely convinced. That evening, the feeling returned with renewed intensity, and this time, Nathan was certain he could hear footsteps circling his tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving around his campsite with deliberate precision and methodical regularity. Nathan turned on his flashlight and looked out of his tent, but there was nothing there. No one, nothing, just the empty forest surrounding his small island of light and warmth. The footsteps continued throughout the night, never coming any closer, never going away, just circling, always present. Nathan lay in his sleeping bag, listening intently, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. It was probably an animal, he told himself. Deer often walk in circles around campfires. Or maybe it was the wind creating sound patterns that his mind was interpreting as footsteps. Or maybe he was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Part 4. The escalation. On Monday, Nathan didn't want to spend another night in the forest, didn't want to endure another night of listening to those circling footsteps, but he'd committed to staying for a week, and he didn't want to fail at this self-imposed challenge or admit defeat to himself. He forced himself to stay at the campsite, telling himself that it was probably just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a curious raccoon or mountain lion, walking around his camp. But deep down, he knew that the footsteps were human. Someone or something was circling his tent every night, observing him, watching him, studying him for reasons he couldn't understand. By Wednesday night, Nathan was beginning to lose his mind in ways he could feel happening. He hadn't slept more than 30 minutes at a stretch for 3 nights. The constant footsteps, the relentless presence of something circling his tent, was driving him toward the edge of panic and psychological breakdown that he could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. That's when he found the evidence that confirmed his worst fears. On Thursday morning, after a particularly sleepless night, filled with endless circling footsteps, Nathan discovered something in his campsite that hadn't been there before, and that made his blood run cold. A footprint in the dirt near his tent. It was a human footprint, and it was recent, probably made within the past few hours. Nathan examined it more carefully with shaking hands. The footprint was about size 11 or 12, and it had been made by someone wearing hiking boots. Someone had been standing right next to his tent while he slept, close enough to touch the tent fabric. Nathan looked around his campsite with growing horror and found more evidence that someone had been there. A cigarette butt, looking like it had been smoked about 3 days ago, lying near his food storage area. A piece of fabric, looking like it had been torn from someone's clothing, hanging from a branch about 10 feet from his tent. Most disturbing of all, Nathan found a piece of paper that had been carefully placed on top of his tent. It was a photograph of Nathan sleeping inside his tent, taken through the tent fabric. Nathan's hands shook uncontrollably as he held the photograph. Someone had been inside his campsite. Someone had gotten close enough to his tent to take a photograph of him through the fabric while he slept, had documented his vulnerability and his exposure in this remote place. The photograph was clear and in focus, and it showed Nathan exactly as he must have looked during the night, lying in his sleeping bag, completely unaware and completely defenseless. The photographer had been close enough to see his face clearly, close enough to reach out and touch him. Part 5. The flight. Nathan didn't waste any more time deliberating or trying to rationalize his experience. He packed up his entire campsite as quickly as he could manage, leaving supplies behind in his haste, and started hiking back down the trail, moving as quickly as he could manage despite the uneven terrain and his exhausted state. He didn't care about following proper procedure, or leaving no trace or any of the outdoor ethics he had learned in college. All he cared about was getting out of that forest and back to civilization and safety. But as he was hiking down the trail, moving as fast as his legs would carry him, Nathan began to notice something that made his adrenaline spike even higher. Footprints in the soft earth of the trail following him, always about 20 or 30 feet behind him, but following nonetheless, keeping pace with him as he moved. Nathan walked faster, his fear overriding his exhaustion. The footprints kept pace. He began to run. The footprints became running footprints, matching his speed, staying at that constant distance of 20 or 30 feet. Nathan ran down that trail for what felt like hours, his lungs burning with exertion, his legs screaming in protest, his mind screaming at him to run faster, faster, faster. He didn't dare look behind him. He didn't dare stop. He ran with the desperation of prey fleeing a predator, with the fear of someone being hunted. Eventually, Nathan emerged at the trailhead, completely exhausted and barely able to stand. He collapsed on the ground for a few minutes, trying to catch his breath, trying to slow his racing heart. When he finally looked up and looked behind him, there was no one there. The footprints had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. The trail behind him was empty, except for the trees and the natural forest floor. It was as if the person who had been following him had simply ceased to exist once he reached civilization. Part 6. The aftermath. Nathan drove away from Eagle Pass Forest and didn't stop until he reached the city and the safety of crowds and people and civilization. He never showed anyone the photograph. He tried to forget about it, tried to put the experience behind him and move on with his life, but he couldn't. Every night, He worried that whoever had taken that photograph knew where he lived, knew his address, knew his routines, knew how to find him in the city where he thought he was safe. He became paranoid in ways that he tried to hide from his colleagues and friends. He started checking his locks obsessively. He installed a security system in his apartment. He bought cameras to monitor his apartment entrance. He became hypervigilant about strangers and suspicious of people who looked at him too long or seemed to pay too much attention to him. Years later, Nathan still doesn't go camping. He refuses to ever go into a forest alone, refuses to venture into any remote area where he might be isolated and vulnerable. And when he does have to travel to rural areas for work, he stays in hotels with multiple locks and security systems, always making sure his windows and doors are secured and locked. He keeps his curtains drawn. He avoids being seen. He never found out who took that photograph or why they'd been watching him or what their motivations were, but he knows that someone was in his campsite while he slept, standing over his tent, watching him through the fabric, documenting his vulnerability with a camera. He knows that person had some kind of plan or purpose that he was never able to understand. Part 7. The Persistence. Sometimes late at night, Nathan thinks he hears footsteps outside his apartment. He wakes up in a cold sweat, certain that someone is circling his apartment building in the darkness, just like they circled his tent years ago. He looks out the window, but there's never anyone there. The footsteps disappear, or he realizes they were just his neighbors or traffic noise that his anxious mind interpreted as threat. He has been to therapy to deal with his trauma from that week in the forest. Therapists have suggested that he experienced some kind of psychological break, that he was hallucinating or suffering from a dissociative episode. But Nathan knows what he experienced was real. He can still see the photograph. He can still feel the presence of someone watching him from the darkness. He can still hear the footsteps circling his tent. He quit his job at the consulting firm about 2 years after his camping experience. The stress and anxiety had become too much to bear, and he couldn't focus on work when he was constantly looking over his shoulder and waiting for the person from the forest to find him. He now works as an independent consultant, choosing projects carefully and working mostly from home, where he feels safe and protected. He has never returned to New York State. He moved to California, thinking distance would provide safety, but he knows it won't. Whoever was watching him in that forest, whoever took that photograph, is still out there somewhere, and Nathan sometimes feels like they're still watching him, still circling, still hunting, just from a greater distance now. Part 8. The Obsession. Nathan has become obsessed with understanding what happened that week. He has read books about stalking and predatory behavior. He has researched serial killers and their patterns. He has read psychological studies about psychopathy and sadism. He has tried to understand the motivations of someone who would watch a stranger sleep and photograph them without consent. He has also become paranoid about his own safety in ways that have affected his ability to function normally. He doesn't have friends anymore. He doesn't want anyone close enough to potentially be used against him. He doesn't have romantic relationships. He can't trust anyone enough to let them into his apartment or his life. He lives in a state of constant vigilance, always watching, always aware, always ready to flee. Sometimes he wonders if he imagined the whole thing, if it was all a psychological episode brought on by stress and isolation. But then he remembers the photograph, the physical evidence that someone had been there, the proof that his experience was real. And he knows that he didn't imagine it. Someone was in his campsite. Someone was watching him. Someone took a photograph, and that photograph is still out there somewhere. Nathan sometimes imagines the person who took it showing it to other people, laughing about the naive young man who thought he could escape civilization and find peace in the forest. He imagines the photograph being shared on the internet, passed around among people who get off on violating others' privacy and safety. He imagines his vulnerable sleeping face being seen by thousands of strangers. The thought makes his skin crawl. It keeps him awake at night. It drives his paranoia and his hypervigilance and his constant state of fear. He knows he will probably never be normal again, never be able to sleep soundly or feel safe or trust strangers. The week in Eagle Pass Forest changed him fundamentally and permanently. It revealed to him that the world was more dangerous than he had realized, that there were people out there who watched and hunted and violated others for their own entertainment and satisfaction, and it showed him that he was vulnerable, that no amount of professional success or achievement could protect him from predators who saw him as prey. Story 9. The Wrong Cabin. Story 9. The Wrong Cabin. 1. The Graduate Student. Andrew Foster, was a graduate student in computer science at a prestigious university in Ontario, Canada, pursuing a PhD in artificial intelligence and machine learning after completing his undergraduate degree at the same institution with distinction. At 25 years old, he was intelligent, capable, and confident in his own abilities to handle challenging situations and solve complex problems through logical analysis and systematic thinking. He came from an academic family. Both his parents were professors. His older sister was a medical doctor. His younger brother was studying engineering. High achievement and intellectual accomplishment were the baseline expectations in the Foster household. Andrew had been a prodigy of sorts, skipping a grade in elementary school, finishing high school at 16, completing his undergraduate degree in 3 years. He had always been the smartest person in the room, had always known the right answer, had always been able to overcome obstacles through intelligence and determination. He had an almost naive confidence in his ability to handle any situation through logical analysis and careful planning. His doctoral research was groundbreaking work in the field of natural language processing. He was working on a project that had the potential to revolutionize how computers understand and interpret human language. He had multiple publications already, had presented his research at international conferences, had been offered several lucrative job offers from tech companies that he had declined because he wanted to complete his PhD. His future seemed bright and unlimited, but graduate school was also isolating and exhausting. He spent most of his time in the lab, coding and debugging programs, analyzing research papers, attending seminars. He had minimal social life. He hadn't been on a date in 2 years. Most of his friendships had faded as his friends graduated and moved away to pursue careers. His relationship with his family was strained. They had high expectations for his achievements and were always pushing him to do more, accomplish more, achieve more. In the spring of 2005, when his older colleague Marcus suggested a hiking trip in the Gatineau Hills area of Quebec, Andrew didn't hesitate to join despite his limited experience with outdoor activities. He saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with nature, to take a break from his research, and to spend time with Marcus, who had become his closest friend in the graduate program. Marcus had described a great hiking route with a cabin-style shelter about halfway through the designated path, where they could rest and spend the night before continuing the next day. It sounded like a perfect adventure, a chance to do something different and potentially transformative. Part 2. The hike. Andrew and his colleague Marcus set out on a Saturday morning in early May, with their backpacks prepared and supplies loaded carefully, according to a list Marcus had created. The hike started well. The weather was pleasant, neither too hot nor too cold. The trail was well marked with blazes painted on trees. They made good progress, moving steadily through the forest, enjoying the natural beauty around them. They talked about their research, about job prospects, about their personal lives and their relationships. Marcus was more outgoing and social than Andrew, and he drew Andrew out of his usual reserved demeanor. By mid-afternoon, they should have been approaching the cabin, but the trail became increasingly unclear. The markers they were looking for, the blazes that should have guided them, seemed to be missing or faded to the point of being invisible. Andrew consulted the map carefully, trying to correlate the topography shown on the map with the actual terrain around them, but something didn't quite match. The terrain didn't seem to align with what the map indicated. The elevation didn't feel right. The distances didn't add up correctly. They continued hiking, assuming they'd find the cabin soon, that it was just around the next bend or beyond the next hill. After hiking for another 2 hours past when the cabin should have appeared, Andrew suggested they turn back. But Marcus insisted on continuing. He was certain the cabin was just around the next bend, just a little further down the trail. Marcus was convinced his memory of the trail was accurate, based on his previous hike through the area. He kept saying, "Trust me, I know this trail." They continued hiking, and as darkness began to fall around them, the forest becoming darker and more ominous with each passing minute, Marcus's confidence seemed to be wavering visibly. Andrew was increasingly convinced they were lost. They were both tired. The sun was disappearing rapidly behind the hills, and there was no sign of any cabin. The forest around them was getting darker with each passing minute, and they were running out of daylight to navigate by. "There!" Marcus suddenly shouted, pointing ahead through the trees. "I see lights!" And indeed, there was a structure ahead, and lights were visible in its windows, glowing warmly in the gathering darkness. Both men felt an enormous sense of relief wash over them. They had found shelter. They wouldn't have to camp in the dark. They picked up their pace and hurried toward the cabin, relief overriding caution. Part 3. The Wrong Place. As they got closer, Andrew began to feel an increasing sense of unease that grew with each step. The cabin looked wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. It was run down, with broken windows and doors that hung at odd angles from their hinges, as if the hinges were damaged or broken. The lights he'd seen seemed to be coming from a very dim, flickering source inside. Not the warm glow of electricity or a well-maintained shelter, but something that looked more like candlelight or firelight. It didn't look like a shelter meant for hikers. It looked abandoned and dangerous, as if no one had maintained it in years, and it was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. "I don't like the looks of this," Andrew said to Marcus, his scientific mind noting the details and filing them away as evidence of something wrong. "Something feels wrong about this place." "We don't have a choice," Marcus replied, his voice carrying resignation. "It's nearly dark. We can't find our way back down the trail in the darkness. We could get lost and hurt ourselves. We'll have to spend the night here and continue in the morning." Marcus seemed to be trying to convince himself as much as Andrew. They approached the cabin cautiously, moving slowly and carefully. The door was ajar, hanging partially open, and when they pushed it, it creaked ominously like something from a horror movie. The interior was dark, and the flickering light they'd seen was coming from a single candle sitting on what appeared to be a table in the center of the main room. The candle cast dancing shadows across the walls, creating the illusion of movement, making the space feel alive and threatening in ways that rational analysis couldn't quite explain away. Andrew's instincts were screaming at him that something was very wrong with this place. He wanted to turn around and leave immediately, wanted to take his chances in the dark forest, rather than spend the night in this decrepit and clearly dangerous structure. But Marcus seemed willing to accept the shelter, despite its obviously poor condition, and Andrew was too exhausted and too polite to argue further or to propose alternative plans. Part 4. The Sounds. They didn't spend the night in the cabin. About 10 minutes after entering and beginning to set up their sleeping areas, Andrew heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin, moving deliberately around it. The footsteps were accompanied by a voice, low and gravelly, speaking words that Andrew couldn't quite make out, but that sounded threatening and dangerous, and completely wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Andrew and Marcus immediately grabbed their packs, their survival instincts overriding their exhaustion and their desire to find shelter. They ran from the cabin into the darkness, following what they hoped was the trail, but they couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them, even with their flashlights. Behind them, they could hear the footsteps, still circling, still following, getting closer with each moment. They ran for what felt like hours in the absolute darkness, pushing through branches that cut their faces, stumbling over rocks and roots, driven by pure fear and the primal need to escape from whatever was chasing them. Andrew's rational mind couldn't process what was happening. Nothing made logical sense. Who would be out here in the middle of the forest in the darkness? Why would anyone be chasing them? Eventually, after hours of running, they burst out onto a road. A car was passing by, and they flagged it down desperately, running into the street and waving their arms frantically. The driver, a concerned woman in her 50s, was shocked by their appearance and condition. They were covered in mud and scratches. They were breathing heavily. Their eyes were wild with fear. She immediately offered them a ride and drove them to the nearest town, where they reported their experience to the local police. Part 5. The Investigation. The police officer they spoke to seemed skeptical and confused by their account. There was a hiking trail in the area, the officer said, and there was an official shelter maintained by the Provincial Park Service. But the location Andrew described, the cabin they'd found, didn't match any known structure in the area. The description didn't correspond to anything the officer was aware of. Andrew and Marcus showed the police officer on a map approximately where they thought the cabin was located. They tried to describe the route they had taken, the terrain they had covered, the distance they had traveled. The officer said that area was national parkland and was completely inaccessible by trail. There was no cabin there, and there was no way they could have reached that location by following the marked hiking trail from the trailhead where they had parked their car. "Are you sure you were on the marked trail?" the officer asked, his skepticism evident in his tone. "I think so," Marcus said, though he sounded uncertain. "We followed the blazes most of the time." "Mostly." "Most of the time?" the officer said. "You got lost, didn't you?" Andrew and Marcus looked at each other. They had gotten lost. Somewhere along the trail, They had apparently deviated from the marked path without realizing it. But that didn't explain the cabin. That didn't explain the person chasing them in the darkness. That didn't explain any of it. Part 6. The aftermath. Andrew and Marcus were never able to figure out exactly what happened that night in the forest. They didn't return to complete their hike. Andrew, in particular, refused to go hiking or camping again. He refused to spend time in remote wilderness areas. To this day, he doesn't know if they'd accidentally strayed into some private land where someone lived, if they'd been deliberately lured off the trail by someone with malicious intent, or if they'd somehow stepped into a place that didn't quite align with normal reality. The image of that dark cabin, with its broken windows and single flickering candle, still visits Andrew in his nightmares. He wakes up in cold sweats, dreaming that he's back in that cabin, that the door is locked, that there's no way out. He wakes up with his heart racing, disoriented, and terrified. Part 7. The investigation. Andrew tried to investigate what had happened. He researched the area extensively, looking for any reports of similar incidents, any stories of other hikers having strange experiences in the Gatineau Hills. He found several anecdotal reports in online hiking forums of people who had reported getting lost in the area, of people who had encountered abandoned cabins, of people who had felt watched or followed in the forest. But there was nothing official, nothing from authorities, nothing that would validate his experience or help him understand what had happened. He contacted the Provincial Park Service and asked about abandoned structures in the area. They were unable to find any record of a cabin matching his description. He asked about incidents in the area, about any reported disappearances or attacks. The Park Service said there had been no incidents that they were aware of. He even hired a private investigator to look into the matter. The investigator searched property records for the area Andrew described, tried to find any evidence of a cabin in that location, tried to find any reports of violent incidents or attacks. The investigator came back with nothing. Either the cabin didn't exist, or it existed outside the normal system of property records and government oversight. Part 8. The changed life. Andrew never completed his PhD. The trauma from that night had shattered his confidence and his ability to focus. He had panic attacks when he tried to work. He became increasingly isolated and withdrawn. He took a leave of absence from the graduate program, which eventually became permanent. He eventually landed a job as a software engineer at a tech company in Toronto, far away from the Gatineau Hills. He makes good money and has job security, but he's never pursued anything particularly ambitious or challenging. He works competently and reliably, but without the passion and drive that had characterized his early academic career. He no longer hikes or camps. He doesn't spend time in forests or remote wilderness areas. He stays in the city, in places where there are people and buildings and civilizational infrastructure. He avoids being alone in unfamiliar places. When he travels, he sticks to major cities and well-traveled routes. Marcus and Andrew remained friends, but they rarely speak about that night. When they do see each other, there's an unspoken acknowledgement of shared trauma, but they don't discuss what happened. It's as if they've tacitly agreed to leave the experience unexamined and unspoken, to accept that some things happened that can't be explained or understood through rational analysis. Part 9. The continuing mystery. To this day, Andrew doesn't know what really happened that night. He doesn't know if the cabin was real, or if they were both hallucinating from stress and exhaustion. He doesn't know if there was actually someone chasing them, or if they imagined the footsteps and the voice. He doesn't know if they had gotten lost and stumbled upon someone's private property, or if they had stepped into some kind of pocket dimension where normal rules of geography and reality didn't apply. But he knows what he experienced. He remembers the fear, the confusion, the sense that something was terribly wrong. He remembers running through the darkness, desperate to escape from something he didn't understand. He remembers the feeling of being hunted, and he knows that it changed him fundamentally and permanently. The confident, ambitious young man, who had believed he could overcome any challenge through intelligence and careful planning, learned that night that there were some things in the world that couldn't be overcome through logical analysis. There were mysteries that couldn't be solved. There were dangers that couldn't be anticipated or prevented. The experience taught Andrew humility and fear in equal measure. It taught him that the world was larger and stranger and more dangerous than his scientific training had led him to believe. And it taught him that sometimes the most intelligent response to a mystery is to avoid it entirely, to accept that some questions don't have answers. Story 10. Beyond the Tree Line. Part 1. The Healer. Christopher Wells was an emergency room nurse in Toronto, Ontario, a job that had transformed him profoundly over the course of a decade of dedicated service to the sick and injured and dying. At 33 years old, he'd seen enough trauma and suffering in his profession to make him genuinely appreciate the simple pleasures of nature and solitude in ways that only people who work with human suffering can truly understand. He had witnessed car accidents and shootings, heart attacks and strokes, overdoses and poisonings, cancer and sepsis, and all manner of human pain and degradation. He had held people's hands as they died. He had comforted families experiencing the worst moments of their lives. He had been trained to manage crisis and maintain composure under impossible circumstances. The emergency room was chaotic beyond description, demanding and emotionally draining in ways that most people couldn't comprehend. Christopher witnessed human pain and suffering on a daily basis, not abstract pain, but real, visceral, physical, and emotional pain that sometimes seemed to saturate the very air of the emergency department. The waiting room was always full of suffering people. The ambulance bay never closed. There was always another patient, another crisis, another life hanging in the balance. Christopher had come into nursing because of genuine desire to help people and to make a difference in their lives. His mother had been a nurse, and he had grown up watching her care for patients with compassion and professionalism. She had died of a stroke when Christopher was in his final year of nursing school. A cruel irony that she had devoted her career to helping people but couldn't save herself. Christopher had finished nursing school and dedicated himself to emergency medicine in her memory. But the job had taken a toll. He had been divorced twice. He didn't have close friends outside of the hospital. He rarely saw his family. His life had become narrowly focused on work, on managing other people's crises, on being strong and competent, and available for whatever the next emergency would bring. He rarely had time to think about himself, about his own needs, about whether his life was actually fulfilling or if he was just going through the motions. He had developed several coping mechanisms over the years. He drank more than was probably healthy. He worked out obsessively at the gym. He spent his days off sleeping or watching television, too emotionally drained to engage with the world. But nothing seemed to truly help. Nothing seemed to provide genuine relief from the weight of the suffering he witnessed every day. In 1999, he decided to take a week off from his hospital responsibilities and go camping in Algonquin Park, one of Canada's most beautiful and vast wilderness areas. He needed to escape the hospital, escape the suffering, escape the constant demands on his emotional resources and his mental health. He needed to remember that there was beauty and peace and gentleness in the world, not just pain and crisis and human degradation. Christopher was an experienced camper and outdoorsman with decades of camping experience accumulated since childhood. He'd been camping regularly since his childhood, when his father had taken him on father-son trips into the Canadian wilderness. He was confident in his survival skills and ability to navigate in the wilderness. He knew how to build fires, how to find water, how to read maps and navigate using a compass. He chose a remote camping location far from other people and set out for what he expected to be a peaceful, restorative week, away from the hospital and all of its demands on his time and energy. Part 2. Peace. The first 2 days were uneventful and exactly what Christopher had hoped for and desperately needed. He hiked through beautiful forests filled with autumn colors, the leaves in shades of red and gold and orange creating a natural cathedral. He fished in a pristine lake and actually caught trout for his dinner, which he cooked over his campfire and ate with genuine appreciation and gratitude. He cooked simple meals over his camping stove, and they tasted better than any food from restaurants or takeout. He spent long hours sitting quietly by his campfire, watching the forest and the water, feeling his anxiety and stress and emotional weight beginning to lift. He felt his mind beginning to quiet for the first time in months. The constant mental noise, the worry about patients, the replay of difficult situations, the consideration of what he should have done differently, began to fade. He was present in the moment. He was alive. He was at peace. He slept well, deeper than he had slept in years, untroubled by the nightmares that usually plagued him. He woke up feeling rested and rejuvenated. He spent his days hiking and fishing and sitting by the water, doing absolutely nothing that required him to think or analyze or make decisions. It was exactly what he needed. But on the third day, strange things started happening that disrupted his peace and began to fill him with an inexplicable sense of unease. Part 3. The voices. First. Christopher heard voices in the distance. They seemed to be calling his name. though the sound was too far away for him to make out individual words or to identify who might be speaking. He tried to locate the source and figure out where they were coming from, but every time he headed toward where he thought the voices were coming from, they would move farther away, as if receding into the forest or being deliberately kept at a distance. The voices were unclear and indistinct, but they seemed to be calling his name, Christopher, Christopher, over and over again, echoing through the trees. On the fourth day, Christopher found evidence of people in the area that suggested he was not as isolated as he had believed. There were footprints around his campsite, but they weren't fresh and recent. They looked old, perhaps weeks old or even months old, worn down by rain and age. There were also remnants of old campsites scattered throughout the area, rusted cans that had oxidized to deep orange, fragments of fabric that had rotted and deteriorated, the ashes of old fires that suggested long-ago camping trips. It was as if dozens of people had camped here over a period of time, and then simply vanished, leaving behind only traces of their presence. Christopher told himself there was nothing unusual about this. Algonquin Park was popular with campers and hikers. Thousands of people visited the park every year. The old signs of previous visitors didn't necessarily mean anything sinister or concerning. He tried to rationalize away his growing sense of unease and convince himself that this was all perfectly normal and explainable. But that night, the voices returned, closer than before and more distinct. And now, Christopher could almost make out words, could almost understand what the voices were trying to communicate. The voices seemed to be pleading, begging for something, though he still couldn't understand exactly what they were saying or what they wanted. The voices sounded desperate and anguished, filled with longing and sadness, and a profound sense of isolation. Part 4. The Discovery. On the fifth day, Christopher found something that deeply disturbed him and filled him with a sense of dread that he couldn't quite explain. A piece of clothing caught on a branch near his campsite. The clothing was torn and rotted, falling apart from age and weather exposure, the fabric disintegrating when he touched it. When Christopher examined it more closely, carefully, and with growing horror, he found a fragment of a label visible despite the deterioration. The label indicated the shirt had been made over 30 years earlier. Christopher began to feel a sense of dread and foreboding that grew with each passing moment. He checked his supplies and realized he had enough food to leave the park early. He decided he'd had enough of Algonquin Park and the strange occurrences that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize away. He started packing his belongings to leave the next morning, eager to return to civilization and to the relative safety and sanity of his apartment and his job. That night, as he was preparing to leave the park and preparing his supplies for an early departure, Christopher heard something that made his blood run cold and his heart begin to race. Music. Someone was playing a radio or a record player in the forest nearby. The music was faint and indistinct, but it sounded like old music, big band music from the 1940s and 1950s, the kind his grandparents had listened to when he was a child and had visited them at their cottage. The music played the same song over and over again in an endless loop that suggested the recording was automated or that someone was deliberately replaying the same song repeatedly. Part 5. The Record Player. Christopher grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound, moving through the forest with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He hiked through the forest for about half a mile before he found the source. A record player, complete with a spinning vinyl record, set up carefully on a rock in a clearing. A vinyl record was spinning, playing the same song over and over again in an endless loop that had apparently been repeating for some time, the machinery worn, but still functional. It looked exactly like the one that Robert Chen had found in Vermont, decades earlier. Or at least, it would have looked similar if Christopher had known about Robert Chen's experience, which he didn't. The record player was powered by a battery pack concealed beneath the rock. The vinyl record was dusty and old, probably from the 1950s based on its appearance. The stylus was still playing, creating sound from the grooves in the record. The whole setup suggested that someone had deliberately placed this record player here, had set it to play on repeat, and had arranged for it to have a power source. This was not something that had been abandoned by accident. This was intentional. This was a message or a trap or something Christopher couldn't quite comprehend. Christopher didn't touch the record player. He knew instinctively that touching it might trigger something, or might alert whoever had set it up. Instead, he turned and ran back to his campsite, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with questions and fear. He gathered his things quickly, all the while listening to that same song playing in the distance on the record player. The music somehow both beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Part 6. The Presence. As he was packing, Christopher heard footsteps. Multiple people, moving through the forest, getting closer with each moment. He could hear them calling to each other, their voices layered and confused, almost as if they were calling from different times, different moments in history, different versions of reality overlapping and bleeding into each other. Christopher didn't wait to see who or what was approaching. He grabbed his backpack and started hiking down the trail as quickly as he could in the darkness, barely able to see where he was going even with his flashlight. He was driven by pure fear and the primal need to escape from something he didn't understand. But as he was hiking, moving as quickly as the trail would allow, Christopher realized something terrifying. The trail was leading him back deeper into the park, not toward the exit and the parking area. Every time he thought he was heading toward the trailhead and civilization, the path would curve back into the deep forest, would redirect him back toward the center of Algonquin Park. He was lost, and it became increasingly clear that he wasn't going to find his way out by following any obvious trail. Part 7. The Bushwhacking. So Christopher did something that ran directly counter to all his outdoor training and professional experience as someone who had spent decades learning. Wilderness survival. He abandoned the trail entirely and began bushwhacking through the forest, using his compass to navigate west toward a road he knew existed somewhere beyond the park boundary. He had hiked these areas before and knew there was civilization beyond the park boundaries. For an hour, he pushed through dense undergrowth and scrambled over rocks and fallen trees, moving as fast as he dared in the darkness. His hands were bleeding from branches and thorns. His clothes were torn and muddy. His breath was coming in panicked gasps. But he was moving toward safety, toward civilization, toward escape. Then, suddenly, the forest ended. Christopher found himself at a cliff edge, looking out at a vast emptiness below him in the absolute darkness. It was too dark to see what was down there. It could have been 1,000-foot drop with rocks at the bottom, or it could have been just a few feet to soft ground. There was no way to know. Christopher had no choice but to backtrack and find another route through the forest. But as he turned to go back into the forest and away from the cliff edge, he heard something that made him freeze in absolute terror. The sound of people walking through the forest, their footsteps synchronized, their breathing audible even from a distance, moving with mechanical precision and purpose. Part 8. The Vision. Christopher stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but wait. And then he saw them. A group of about 15 people, moving through the forest in a strange, shuffling gait that was wrong in ways that Christopher's trained medical mind immediately recognized as unnatural. Their movements were mechanical and jerky, unnatural and disturbing. Their faces were pale, almost translucent in the dim light filtering through the trees. They looked like they'd been dead for a very long time, but were still somehow walking and moving through the physical world, animated by some force that had nothing to do with normal human physiology and consciousness. These were not living people. These were something else, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. Christopher didn't hesitate. He jumped off the cliff. He plummeted through darkness for a few seconds that felt like an eternity, his body falling through empty space, his mind filled with the certainty that he was about to die. Then he hit water, a deep lake below the cliff that he couldn't have known was there in the darkness. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and sent shockwaves through his entire body. For a moment, he thought the impact would kill him, that his ribs were broken, that he was dying. But he survived. He swam frantically through the cold water toward what he could hear was solid ground, pulled himself out of the water shivering and gasping, and began running through the forest, completely disoriented and terrified, and driven by the absolute need to escape from those things that had been walking through the forest. Part 9. The Escape. Christopher ran through the forest, completely disoriented, until he burst out onto a road. He flagged down a passing truck, and the driver, shocked by his appearance and condition, immediately drove him to the nearest hospital where he was admitted. Christopher was treated for hypothermia and several injuries sustained from the jump and his running through the forest. He was also evaluated by a psychiatrist who suggested that he may have experienced a dissociative episode caused by sleep deprivation and stress from his job in the emergency room. Christopher didn't argue with the psychiatrist. He knew what he'd seen, but he also knew that no one would believe him. He was discharged from the hospital a few days later, with prescriptions for antidepressants and a recommendation that he take time off from work. Part 10. The haunting Christopher never returned to Algonquin Park. In fact, he rarely speaks about his experience there, but occasionally, late at night, he still hears that music, the same big band song that was playing on the record player, and he wonders if, somehow, the forest followed him home, if something from that place remained connected to him, if the boundary between the normal world and that cursed place is thinner than most people realize. He wonders if somewhere in that vast wilderness, the voices are still calling. He wonders if the spirits of all those lost hikers, the people who disappeared decades ago, the people whose old campsites he found scattered throughout the park, the people who were somehow still walking but not alive, are still wandering through the forest, still hoping for someone to join them in their eternal wandering. Sometimes he wakes up in a cold sweat, believing he's back in the forest, that everything that happened after that night was just a dream, that the nightmare is still ongoing. Sometimes he hears footsteps outside his apartment, and his heart races with terror. Sometimes he smells the forest, pine and earth and decay, and for a moment he's back there, back at the cliff edge, seeing those pale faces and jerking movements. He left his job at the hospital 2 years after his camping experience. The work had become impossible. He couldn't focus on helping other people when he was constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for something from the forest to claim him, waiting to hear that song, or those voices, or the footsteps of those things that had been walking through the darkness. He lives quietly now in a small apartment, rarely leaves home, works from home as a medical consultant, reviewing cases for hospitals and insurance companies. He has minimal contact with other people. He has learned to live with the trauma and the knowledge that there are places in the world where the normal rules of reality don't apply, where things exist that can't be explained through science or logic or rational thought. Epilogue. The connection. Christopher doesn't know that other people have had similar experiences in different forests. He doesn't know about James Mitchell and his encounter with Edward at Moosehead Lake. He doesn't know about Patrick Sullivan's experience on Blackwater Trail, or Victor Reeves's escape from the Saddleback Mountains, or Nathan Pierce's paranoia about the photographer in Eagle Pass Forest, or Andrew Foster's terror in the Gatineau Hills. He doesn't know that there seem to be certain places in the world, deep forests, remote mountains, wilderness areas far from civilization, where the boundary between the normal world and something else becomes thin and permeable, where things happen that can't be explained or rationalized away. If he did know about these other experiences, would it comfort him to know he wasn't alone? Would it help to understand that what he experienced was part of a larger pattern, that there were other people who had encountered the impossible and survived? Or would it terrify him further to realize that there were many such places, many such encounters, and that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than most people ever suspected? Christopher will probably never know. He has learned to accept mystery and strangeness as part of his new reality. He has learned to live with fear and uncertainty, and he has learned that some experiences, no matter how transformative or terrifying, can never be fully shared or explained to people who haven't lived through them themselves. Some truths can only be understood by those who have encountered the impossible and somehow survived to tell about it.